All right, good morning, everyone. This is the Tuesday, October 2nd, Montgomery County Council session. We'll begin today with a moment of silence. The anticipated leader of a invocation was not able to make it, so moment of silence. Thank you. And we'll begin with a presentation. We have a proclamation recognizing the Montgomery County Interagency Cybersecurity Month by Councilmember Sidney Katz.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. President. If I could please invite the following to join us from the Montgomery County government: Keith Young, Joan Cole, Sonny, I think it's his whole front row eventually, but Sonny Siegel, Dieter Klinger, Ivan Galick, from Montgomery College, Patrick Feehan, from the Maryland National Capital Parks and Planning, Dr. Henry Mobayini, Ellie Mosini, Dominique Neem, from the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission, Christine Gruby, from Montgomery County Public Schools, Chuck McGee, Tom Chapman, and from the Montgomery County Council, Dr. Costas Terragas and Gary Thomas. National Cybersecurity Month is observed annually every October, and it's collaborative and it's a shared responsibility. Today, we proclaim October 2018 as the Interagency Cybersecurity Awareness Month to recognize the innovative collective work done here in Montgomery County by the Interagency Technology Policy and Coordination Committee, better known as ITPCC. They convene county agency chief executives and chief information officer. The group provides an effective forum to coordinate implementation of technology policy and guidelines. The ITPCC has put together a rich programming schedule for the month. We encourage everyone to participate. Topics include simple steps to your online safety, the ever-changing internet landscape, information security in the workplace is their shared responsibility, building resilience in critical infrastructure, and promoting cybersecurity awareness best practices. And because of all of that, we have a proclamation. Whereas National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, NCSAM, observed annually every October, is a collaborative effort between government and industry to ensure every American has access to the information and resources they need for safe and secure online activities, and whereas with increasing frequency and sophistication, malicious actors in cyberspace are attacking our critical infrastructure sectors, businesses, state and local governments, academic institutions, healthcare systems, public safety, national security infrastructure, individuals, and whereas Montgomery County, a 2018 NSSAM champion, recognizes that it has a vital role in identifying, protecting, and responding to cyber threats that may have significant impact on individual and collective security and privacy, and whereas maintaining the security of cyberspace is a shared responsibility in which each of us has a critical role to play as a part of the national public awareness campaign, Stop, Think, Connect, and to get informed and engage best practices, and whereas in 2018, the Interagency Technology Policy and Coordination Committee initiated the Interagency Cybersecurity Awareness Month project to encourage multi-agency collaboration to promote cyber awareness and to provide Montgomery County employees and residents with information, guidance, and tools needed to become a safer and more secure online. And now, therefore, this proclamation has been signed by the County Executive, Isaiah Leggett, and our County Council President, Hans Reamer, and it's proclaimed today. Congratulations. And Sonny, I guess, is going to speak. Sonny's speaking. Did you want to hold it? Oh, well, I can hold it, then we'll get a picture.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Councilmember Katz. Thank you to the entire County Council for your guidance, and especially to the Government Operations Committee. Councilmember Navarro is the chair, for their guidance in making this possible, this joint collaborative effort between the agencies to kick off the Cyber Awareness Month of October. This is, of course, as Councilmember Katz said and the proclamation reads, the first time that we have joined our efforts and coordinated our events throughout the agencies on Cyber Month. Without dwelling on it too much, it is true that each of us, every one of us, is responsible for the security of the information and the systems that the government uses in any of the agencies. And so with that, I'm honored to actually be representing the work of our cybersecurity officials and the teams in each of the agencies. And I look forward to a successful month of awareness. Thank you.
Thank you. And as you can see, we invited the GO Committee Chair, Vice President of Council Nancy Navarro, and the President of Council, who also happens to be on the GO Chair, on the GO Committee, to be with us on this picture as well. Would you like to hold it, please?
All right, thank you, Councilmember Katz. Now, we'll proceed to our items of general business. We have announcements. Clerk Lamarzi.
Thank you. Good morning. The council is seeking applicants for the Board of Appeals. The position can only be filled by a Republican, a voter who is unaffiliated with a party, or a voter who is a member of another party officially recognized by the Board of Elections. The application deadline is October 10th at 5 p.m. The council has received 3 petitions this week. One petition is signed by 70 individuals. It is from residents of Highland View in Silver Spring, supporting additional police presence, security cameras, and flood lighting in the neighborhood and at Highland View Elementary School. Second petition is from residents of Montgomery County supporting the expansion of Ride-On Bus number 4 and the service between the Silver Spring Metro and Kensington for the National Park Seminary community. And the third petition, which is signed by 39 individuals, is from the Neighbors for Informed Community Engagement in support of the repaving of Green Tree Road from 7 Locks Road to the maintenance facility of Bethesda Country Club.
Thank you. And now we will turn to the approval of minutes for September 11th and September 18th, 2018. And those minutes were distributed in advance. Are there any corrections to the minutes? All right, not seeing any corrections. Those minutes are approved as received. And now we will turn to our consent calendar. We need a motion. It's been moved by Mr. Rice, seconded by Mr. Berliner. And there are a number of appointments to different boards and committees, and I know that sometimes those who are appointed want to know if they will indeed receive a majority vote at the council. Fortunately, it is an item of consent that we have a vetting process for these appointments, and we always approve them on the consent calendar, which unfortunately does mean we won't necessarily have a chance to mention the name of everyone who's been nominated or discuss their qualifications, but we do really appreciate the service of everyone who is being appointed today. They're going to have a lot of evening commitments and work to do, and it really contributes a lot to our civic culture here and to our governance. So thank you to everyone for volunteering for these roles of community service. Councilmember Florine.
Thank you very much. Two things. I wanted to reference the report that's come out from the Office of Legislative Oversight. This is one I asked them to conduct with respect to evictions in Montgomery County. There was a book that I made of it. I think I gave every member of the council a copy of the book about evictions last year. And I think this is an important issue. It will be an important issue for the next council to take up. It's really the underside of our housing issues, usually the product of complex community and family issues. And we never really talked about this before, but this is how families get disrupted, how families become homeless, how people lose their way. And so I'm very pleased that the Office of Legislative Oversight has delivered up this report. One of the members of the General Assembly has been having some meetings on this, I know, Janelle Wilkins, I believe, and we let her know that this was coming out so that would offer her some background information as to how the General Assembly takes a look at this issue. So I'm very glad to see that. The second thing is I would like to be recorded in the negative on item number 3B. This has to do with the increase in fees for really the fire code compliance efforts. I think our fees cannot be permitted to keep rising and rising and rising and rising. They've got issues and reasons for why that's provided, but I think this is the wrong time to raise these fees, and I think we have to revisit a number of assumptions about how we handle fees here in Montgomery County. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Florine. I really appreciate your bringing the issue of eviction forward and the inspiration from that book. I look forward to reading that book and the report and taking this up in the next council. Thank you. Mr. Rice.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'd like to highlight for my colleagues item N, which is a categorical transfer of $1.6 million for MCPS's operating budget. There's also a categorical transfer. It should actually reflect $750,000. There was an amendment in the Education Committee. It's actually in your packet if you look on the first page of 3N, but unfortunately it wasn't translated to the clerk. And so it should actually reflect $750,000. So I'd just like to put that for the record, but it is reflected in the packet that you did receive as well.
Thank you, Mr. Rice, for your detailed review. And it has been moved and seconded. All those in favor of the consent calendar, show of hands. That is unanimous. Except as recorded. Thank you. All right. Now we will turn to legislative session day number 22, introduction of bills. There are 3 bills being introduced today. The first, Bill 3318, Environmental Sustainability Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy Program, Property Tax Surcharge. Lead sponsor, Councilmember Berliner. Co-sponsors, Councilmembers Katz and Elrich. Mr. Berliner.
Very briefly, colleagues, our commercial PACE program, Property Assessed Clean Energy, is one of the most important programs we adopted to help retrofit our existing buildings. We've done a lot for new buildings and new building standards, but the reality, of course, is it's our existing buildings that we need to attack, if you will. And so our commercial PACE program actually doesn't cost the county any dollars. It just facilitates private lenders lending to building owners and having that secured, if you will, by property taxes. Our county is the only county in the country to not allow the loan to be placed prior to when the improvements actually are made. We are literally the only county in the country that does it this way based on the information we've been given. And so it has been suggested that we change it because it's getting in the way. It's requiring building owners to get gap financing in order to do it, and that raises the cost. It's a barrier. We don't need barriers, and the risk is so infinitesimally small to begin with. So this addresses that. I've met with finance. We're having ongoing conversations to see if we can't find common ground. But to me, this is almost a no-brainer, and so urge ultimately my colleagues to support it.
Having no brain, I'll sign on as a co-sponsor. Hope that clip doesn't come back to haunt me. Keep things light. Thank you, Mr. Berliner. Appreciate your work on these issues. If you're putting your light on to sign on as a co-sponsor, maybe we could just do a round of that. If you want to make comments, I will, let's see who's next. Mr. Hucker.
I think it's a great bill, and I had asked to be signed on as co-sponsor.
Okay,
Thank you.
very good.
Co-sponsor as well.
Okay, Mr. Rice? Ms. Navarro, Vice President? Terrific. Okay, we recorded those co-sponsors. All right. Now, we'll move to the next item B. Bill 3418, Human Rights and Civil Liberties, County Minimum Wage, Definitions Employer, lead sponsor Council President Reamer, co-sponsor Council Member Hucker. I will just briefly describe this item. I consider this a housekeeping item or a clarification item as we grappled with the minimum wage policy that we enacted and have enacted over the last few years. I think it was our intent as a council that employers with fewer than 10 employees would include employers that have one employee. However, we've come to learn that there is sort of a provision in state law that results in that not being the case. And so for those employers who have a single employee, they are not actually, it turns out, governed by our county law. So this is intending to just tighten that up and ensure that the intent of the council in passing its previous minimum wage will be fulfilled. I don't think it expands into other policy areas or makes other policy decisions. And I want to also just stress there may unfortunately be some confusion about the issue of, does this mean that I have to hire people as an employee who I wasn't previously hiring as an employee, particularly in a household environment? I want to say that that is a matter of federal law, and you should consult federal law to determine whether you are hiring someone as an employee appropriately. And we have no purview over that question. We don't affect that question, and this law doesn't have any impact on that question. That is a matter of federal law. Whether you should hire someone as a contractor or as an employee is based on very certain requirements in federal law. So we do not have any impact on that decision that an employer should make. But we are saying that when you have an employee, that we intend for that employee to have the minimum wage that we intend for employers that have 2 employees or 3 employees up to 10. So that is the intent here, and I will turn to my colleagues for comments. Mr. Rice.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me before this bill came to the council to discuss some of those concerns that are similar to what you just addressed. I will just say that there seems to still be some questions that may be out there regarding some professions. I completely agree with the target of where you're trying to go, and for the proponents of this bill are trying to go in terms of ensuring that the minimum wage does apply to them. I am concerned that there may be some other ancillary pieces of this, including things that then dovetail into our county sick and safe leave, and it has some other potential implications. So we'll certainly look to hear those and work through those kinds of issues, but did just want to appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and try and work through this, and I know that we'll be able to find a resolution. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Ms. Florine.
Thank you. Well, I have some concerns about this, and I'm assuming, based on the schedule that's reflected here, that it's anticipated that this council is expected to take action on it. If that is indeed the case, I would like to ask staff to make sure that we are reminded of why we enacted the laws we did without having it apply to just one employee. There are a lot of under-the-counter relationships that occur, particularly with household employees, non-reported kinds of things that I don't think we want to encourage. But this sort of thing can drive that. I don't remember all the history on that when we talked about this previously, so if you would be so kind as to when the council or committee gets to this, that be included in the briefing materials. I'd appreciate it. I just don't remember the conversation, but I don't think it was, I think it was a deliberate choice, not something that we forgot to do. So
Okay.
Thank you.
Could I just ask you to briefly explain this legislation in your words so that council members aren't relying on my explanation?
Well, everything you said is correct. I mean, right now, you have to have 2 or more employees to be covered by our minimum wage law. Our minimum wage law also has exceptions for any jobs that are excluded from the federal Fair Labor Standards Act, and so there are some jobs that were discussed, like casual babysitting, which is excluded from the federal law and would still be excluded under our law. This wouldn't change that. This would apply just to somebody, as you said, who is actually an employee, not an independent contractor, and is working, and if they're the only employee. As far as the original intent, we'll look into that and discuss it, I mean, in the packet, and go back and look at what we were thinking at the time.
Thank you, Bob. All right, we'll take this up at committee, and we'll be in consultation with council members. Okay, moving on to the next item, introduction of Bill 3518, Health and Sanitation, Smoking, Outdoor Serving Areas. Lead sponsor, Councilmember Katz. Co-sponsors, Council President Reamer, Councilmember Elrich. Mr. Katz.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. As many of you will recall, several years ago, indoor smoking was banned in restaurants and other establishments in Montgomery County. Fairly recently, I think within the last year or so, both the cities of Rockville and the city of Gaithersburg banned it on the outside, the dining areas of a serving area of a restaurant. And because we have a history of knowing how those businesses have been affected, I thought that it was appropriate. We were contacted by several residents that if we would bring this to public hearing so we could have a public discussion on it. Obviously, it's caused some discussions on both sides, and we look forward to the public discussion. But the companion piece with this is under 6A from Board of Health. So that if we do one, then it would be under Board of Health as well, and therefore every municipality would be covered by that legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Katz. All right, and moving on to items of miscellaneous business, we have action on an item, a resolution to extend expiration date until June 30th, 2019 for Bill 1017, Recordation Tax Rates Amendments. This needs a motion and a second. Been moved by Mr. Rice, second by Mr. Berliner. All those in favor of extending the timeline? That is unanimous. And now we'll move to call of bills for final reading. We're going to have four bills, and they're all before us as their committee recommendations, and I'll turn to the committee chairs. There'll be roll call votes. And the first is Contracts, Labor Peace Agreements, Displaced Service Workers Amendments. Council Vice President Navarro.
Thank you, Mr. President. And this Bill 6-18, Contracts, Labor Peace Agreements, Displaced Service Workers. This bill was approved 3-0 by the GO committee with amendments. The bill sponsor is Councilmember Elrich and Hucker, and the co-sponsors are Councilmember Rice and myself. The intent of the legislation is to ensure that contractual services are not interrupted by a strike by the contractor's employees or a lockout of the contractor's employees due to a labor dispute. This bill, is introduced, would require certain county contractors to enter into labor peace agreement with a labor organization, establish minimum requirements for a labor peace agreement, require certain county multi-term contracts to include a minimum price increase provision, and add certain workers performing services under a county residential solid waste collection contract to the County Displaced Workers Protection Act. Our committee amended the bill on July 9th and September 17th, and we agreed to restrict the application of the bill to county trash hauling and recycling contracts, to remove the definition of a neutrality agreement and reference to it in the bill, and clarify that the labor peace agreement only applies to employees performing work on the contract. We also added language to have the chief administrative officer consider the history of strikes or lockouts disrupting county services provided by the contract when considering requirement for labor peace agreement. You can find that on page 7. Require an increase to the contract price sufficient to cover an increase in labor costs up to the general wage increase approved for county service labor and trades bargaining unit. You can find that on page 9. Limit the hiring of the former contractor's employees to the extent the contractor needs to hire new employees, and you can find that on page 13. Also, the committee requested language to say that wage increases do not preclude other increases for demonstrated expenses. For example, increased fuel prices, and that language is highlighted on circle page 3 in your packet. We had Mr. Drummer, who helped us through this whole process, and as I said, we had, extensive conversations and discussions on the GO committee regarding this, but this is what we ended up with, and that's before you. And of course, Mr. Drummer and Ms. Myhill are here as well in case you have any further questions.
Very good. I apologize. I was in dialogue with my colleague. Should we turn it to council members now, or are you suggesting staff?
Yes, I already reported what the GO committee decided, and I
Very
just
good.
said that we have staff here in case there are any particular questions from my
Okay.
colleagues.
Very good. Ms. Florine.
Thank you. Well, I haven't really been engaged in this, so I do have some basic questions, particularly with respect to how it's been amended in committee as well. So forgive me if I go back to some basics. So I have to ask, is this correct that all this goes into place based upon the decision of the county executive to direct the CAO to proceed under these circumstances? Is that the triggering element for all of these elements?
Only for the labor peace agreement requirement. It's something that would be put in the solicitation. The director of procurement would recommend it to the chief administrative officer, who would then make a decision. If the chief administrative officer directed that there be a labor peace agreement in the solicitation, then it becomes mandatory for everybody who bids on the contract,
And
whoever is awarded the contract, really.
Does that also affect the issue of the minimum price increase provision?
No, that would be a requirement on any multi-year contract for trash hauling or recycling. And the displaced service worker would also be mandatory for trash hauling and recycling contracts without regard to a decision by the CAO.
Okay,
Those two
so
would be
those
automatic.
those would be baked into the
Yes.
process. And so my question is why? Because these are negotiated, these are bid contracts, correct?
Yes,
Theoretically, at least, you put it out, you have public bidding, you have competition. That's the intention, right?
that's right. These are bid on, I believe, competitive sealed bidding.
Is that right?
Yes.
And at the end of the day, who pays for this? The individual parties,
well,
right?
It's actually part of it's like a user fee. There's an enterprise fund set up for solid waste management, and if you're in the county solid waste area, not the entire county, the entire county is not covered. If you're in that area, you'll see a little charge for solid waste and recycling on your tax bill. And so that's who pays for the cost. They calculate it out every year.
So it's not part of the tax bill per se. It's a separate charge associated with trash hauling.
Right. It's not from the property tax. It's an enterprise fund paid for with the solid waste and recycling charge.
So whatever the price ends up under this process, it's the individual homeowner who will be assessed their portion, however that's calculated. There's some kind of math associated with how that applies to those portions of the county that get these services.
Right. I mean, there's a lot goes into the calculation
Right.
other than the cost of these contracts. But
Some kind of
yes.
algorithm.
Well,
Probably
I think
like
it's
Facebook.
a calculation done by environmental protection and provided to finance.
All that sort of thing. So what this does is it mandates an increase in the contract. Is that correct? No matter what?
Well, what this does is requires that if you have a multi-year contract, and all these contracts have been multi-year contracts because of the upfront equipment costs, that after the first year, the contractor is entitled to a price increase to cover any increase in wages that the employer provided to the contractors working on the contract.
Is that the existing law?
No, the existing law, there's no provisions at all about price increases. However, our contracts, and this is a contractual provision currently, permits the contractor to come in and ask for a price increase based on an increase in costs, and they generally get an adjustment. Well, I believe it's been close to the consumer price index change is what they've been getting. It's not based on their wage increases. And in fact, they don't have to provide any wage increases to get the adjustment. They just have to show their increased costs. This would actually require them to show that they provided an increase in wages to get this increase. But it also permits it doesn't in any way prohibit the standard provision that allows a contractor to seek an increase in costs that are not related to labor, such as fuel prices.
So is it fair to say that historically, if you had this kind of contract with the county, I think what you're saying is each year the holder of the contract could come in and ask for an increase based on increased costs. However, and this would be reflected in a variety of areas. It could be employee needs, it could be other regulatory obligations, cost of fuel, cost of whatever.
Well, all this provision
that's
in the
a current law,
yeah,
right?
well, I mean, that's a contractual provision that
Yeah.
may or may not show up in future solicitations.
Right.
What is required by this law, though, is a mandatory increase to cover wage increases up to, and I should say this just to make it clear, I think Councilmember Navarro did mention this, but it's up to the general wage adjustment provided to the McGeo employees in the Service, Labor, and Trades bargaining unit. So if, like this year, they got a 2% raise starting in December, that would be the maximum that they would get a price increase to cover. They could give their employees 20% if they want to, but they're only going to get from the county up to 2%. You're only going to get an increase in the price to cover up to 2%.
Well, is there something in here that says this is also based on performance?
No.
So if someone has a contract which is not serving, which is generating concerns from the people who pay the bill, our community members. Is there any way that that is addressed in this built-in increase?
No,
No.
that's not part of this.
So
I mean, the contract itself would have other
presumably it
provisions.
calls for that.
Would have other
Procurement has
provisions to
certain-
deal with
right, procurement has
failure
certain laws
to.
built into the contract. And I just very quickly want to say that the reason why we amended this bill was to narrow it to trash haulers and recycling was precisely because we are very aware of how important it is for our constituents to ensure that they have continuity and proper trash collection and recycling. There was a particular issue with a lockout and a strike that obviously caused a lot of problems. And when the conversation was had with the contractors, they spoke about the fact that they have very, limited margin of their profit. And it was very difficult to give any kind of appropriate wage increase to these workers who actually are providing a pretty high-risk type of endeavor since they're jumping off and on from the trucks. And so that's why we took our time to, A, narrow it, but also understanding that if it were to be brought into county government, if these contracts, instead of us outsourcing it, would be brought into county government, it would be a lot more expensive to our bottom line. And so we're trying to strike a balance with giving these low-wage workers really an opportunity for an increase that, as I said, would be capped, but also to ensure then that we have this continuity. And that's the gist of the bill. It's narrowed, it's in its scope, but it recognizes that this is a fundamental service that our residents expect. Now, if the contractor is not performing, for example, then that is basically part of the procurement process, and they would be dealt with accordingly. But this is particularly just to make sure that these folks are paid reasonably well, and that they can provide the best quality service. That's the gist of the bill.
Well, fine, but it seems to me that these are all things that already could be negotiated. I'm not sure, I'm still not hearing why we need legislation to put this into place. It would seem to me that the CAO and our procurement people have an obligation to make sure that these services, indeed, I don't disagree with that need, to make sure that this is, these services are provided in a reliable fashion. But they also have an obligation to make sure that costs are appropriate, that increases are not unreasonable, and that there may be moving parts in any contract with respect to how one defines one's margins to be re-examined. I see there was a preemption issue that was addressed by making some of this a choice as opposed to a requirement with respect to the labor peace agreements, correct? That's the way we skirt that issue.
Well, the labor peace agreement is based on the need for the county to protect its contract services, and the exception under the federal law is if you're acting as a market participant and not trying to regulate labor relations among the private sector. And so we tried to narrow the bill to make it clear that we're just dealing with situations where we have had a history of strikes that do interrupt services that are critically important to our residents, and that we're worried about the contract being, the service being provided, and not trying to regulate labor relations.
But only that we are trying to regulate labor relations if we are requiring certain increases in employment and payment. How is that not regulating it?
Well, we're not requiring any increases in the salaries paid to the workers other than what we do for these employees would be covered by the living wage law.
Well,
but assuming they're not at the
I thought it
bottom,
was
there wouldn't be any, it doesn't require any wage increases. It requires the county to fund the wage increases, which would encourage the employer, make it easier for the employer to give the wage increase, but it doesn't require them to do it.
So
They
it
don't have to give a
requires the
wage
contract amount to go up, but not that the employees be paid?
No, the employees would, no, this provision is actually drawn
I thought it was a
to-
mandate.
to-
I was just reading your memo. I'm just trying to understand what you're saying. I thought
Okay.
you said there's a mandatory CPI increase in here,
that was the original bill.
and now there's no
And
mandatory
No
increase?
mandatory CPI increase.
So there's,
Because the committee felt that the mandatory CPI increase didn't necessarily find its way into the pockets of the workers. So the provision was amended to make it clear that you only get an increase under this statute to the extent you can show that you've raised the wages of the workers working on the contract.
oh, so is that the language on page 9? Contract price increase provision?
No.
That's what
not
the union
No, that's not what,
submitted.
that's what the union submitted. The language that's actually in the bill is on circle, it's lines 24 to 41 of the bill on circle 2 and 4.
Circle 2. So this is the amended bill here at the bottom of, circle 2 at the bottom there?
Yeah, actually, it starts on page circle 2, lines 24, and goes through 41 on page circle 3. The language that's actually in the bill, you can see what's been bracketed out, is the original CPI language, and the new language is an amount sufficient to compensate the contractor for an increase in wages for the employees performing work on a covered contract to the extent the increase in wages does not exceed the last general wage increase approved by the county for members of the Service, Labor, and Trades Bargaining Unit established in Section 33105A1.
So what this says, though, it says that we must include, contract must include a price increase.
Well, it must include the price increase provision that I
Provision.
just read to you. So it
That-
requires the contractor to show that his cost went up because he gave his employees more money.
I don't see how that achieves that end. It says an amount sufficient to compensate the contractor for an increase in wages.
All right, well, the county
But
doesn't pay the
presumably,
wages.
that, they have to demonstrate that they actually have, but that doesn't say that. Like, if I were to, I'm just saying, I don't not see, the only way for this to make any sense is it for it to be prescriptive, to require an increase in wages. And if that is the case, I don't know how that is not engaged in the labor. It's not just us soliciting a contract in the marketplace. It's us regulating how that contract is employed with respect to the internal workings of the employer, correct?
Well, that's why the provision doesn't require the contractor to raise the wages of its employees every year.
So if
It's
that's the case,
simply-
why are we doing this?
Because what it does is it permits the employer, if they do raise the wages, to get the money back in a price increase from the county.
And I thought we heard that that's already part of the conversation.
Well, what's in the conversation, what's in the contracts today is they can come to the county and get an
And ask.
increase for any of the costs. So they could do that today under the current
Right.
provision.
But this requires that there be a price increase based on this sort of
If they raise
effort.
if they
Requires
raise
it.
the wages.
Regardless of whether we have satisfactory service, regardless of whether we might have competition from someone else who could provide the same or better service with even better pay for their employees, depending on how they manage their margins and their operations. I mean, this is getting deep into how one particular employer may choose to manage this contract and manage their employers, if you ask me, without providing for protection, A, of the people who have to actually pay the bill, because it's not the county, it's the individual person who's paying for this. So it's one thing for us to say to our employees, okay, you know, we support your work, you're doing a great job, this is your increase. This is saying to employer, whatever, if you're paying your people more money, your prices will go up, regardless of any other relevant factor. So
Well,
I'm just saying for the record, I have some concerns with this. I'm not sure I understand. I understand that, you know, it's interesting, when not having been a candidate, I missed out on a lot of conversations with unions and the like in the political process. And I'm coming to appreciate what my colleagues have been dealing with over the past year. I came to realize that with respect to the position of the environmental policy position, that is what the Sierra Club wanted. That was the last piece of legislation required by politics. This is the next one. I don't think this is the right way to operate.
Thank you, Ms. Florine. Mr. Leventhal.
Mr. Drummer, I understand the committee discussed the issue that the owner of the company could simply pocket the guaranteed increase in the contract and not pass it through to the employees. Now, you've said that you can only get, the company may only get the guaranteed price increase if wage increase is provided. But as I read line 33, I don't read it that way. The owner of the company is guaranteed each year to get an amount sufficient to compensate the contractor for an increase in wages. I don't see where this bill compels the contractor to provide an increase in wages. And I don't see how we are protecting against the owner of the company just pocketing the money himself or herself and not passing it through to employees. How do we protect against that?
Well, first of all, it doesn't require an increase in wages to anybody. But what it does do is the contract, I mean, either procurement or DEP, somebody is going to have to audit their books to find out that their cost went up because they actually paid their employees more and they
Bob,
gave them a pay increase.
Bob, that's Bob Drummer talking. Where does the bill say that? You just said that DEP or somebody, don't know who somebody is, must audit the contract. Well, that's a very authoritative statement from the legislative attorney to the county council. I don't see that in the bill.
Well,
where's the audit?
Well, all our contracts have an audit provision in it already. I mean, that's already in the general conditions for the contract, that we have the right to audit the contractor's books. And in order for them to get the increase that this provision permits, they're going to have to demonstrate that they actually provided wage increases to their employees.
The bill doesn't say that unless I'm missing. Is there a line that says they're going to have to document that they provided the increase? I don't see that in the bill.
Well, all this provision is it's a requirement that there be a provision in the contract that provides an increase in the contract price due to an increase in wages. The counties, the procurement is then going to have to draft a contractual language that requires the implementation of this and requires them to provide documentation that proves that they actually paid their employees more. I mean, that's getting too much into the weeds in the statute.
Well, I'm just going to repeat, as I read this, it seems to me the risk still exists, that there is a guaranteed price escalator. That's clear. Every year, payment from the county to the company increases, guaranteed, by up to the amount that would be the equivalent of the pay increase received by McGeo employees. What I'm not seeing, I'm reading the bill, I've read it and read it and read it, I've spent some time on this. I still think there is a risk. I don't think the bill addresses the risk that the employer, the owner of the trash hauling company, will take that increase each year and that the employees will not get a wage increase. I don't see how this bill addresses that risk. Not in the bill. You're making a bunch of assurances that here's what will have to happen. Procurement will do this and DEP will do that, but I don't see where the bill requires any of that. So it seems to me that there remains a risk, as this bill is before us now, that the cost increase will be pocketed by the owner of the company. I don't see how the bill addresses that. So that's my first question and observation. My second question has to do with the labor peace agreement language. As it was described to me, this whole procedure is purely optional on the part of the CAO and the county executive. But I don't read the bill that way. I'm reading the actual statutory language. What I'm seeing here on lines 86 to 88 is that the director, the DEP director, must determine if a labor peace agreement would be in the best interest of the county. Now, it would seem to me that in an ideal world, if you want vital services to be delivered, there would never be a strike and there would never be a lockout. So it's hard for me to imagine how, given the next section, then you say, no, I understand. The director reports to the chief administrative officer, and then the chief administrative officer has to decide whether or not to approve that recommendation. Okay, I see that. Go ahead, Mr. Hucker, I'll yield to you for a clarification.
Section B.
Right. It is optional for the CAO to determine. Okay. Now, because the law, now, in the answer to my previous question, you made some assumptions about what's going to happen on administratively based on what the law requires, even though, unless I'm missing it, the law does not require that the wage increase actually take place. I don't see that in the law. Here, it seems to me that there's a very strong presumption that the labor peace agreement will be entered into because it could be challenged in court. The law provides, once we pass this, that these things must happen. The director must issue a finding. And then if the chief administrative officer agrees with the finding, but there isn't any basis on which the chief administrative officer really would say no. I mean, once the recommendation has been made and documented, which I assume there's going to have to be something in writing. I mean, in each contract, the director must make a determination by law, and presumably that determination must be documented. So it's very hard to imagine that the director would find that a labor peace agreement isn't in the best interest, because why would it not be in the best interest? I mean, we don't want to strike, we don't want to lock out. It's hard to imagine a situation where we would not want that. And then the director goes to the CAO, and it seems to me we're opening ourselves up to court action if the CAO ever says, well, I don't care what the director found, even though the director presumably has to document his or her decision. The law would seem very, very much to mitigate in favor of labor peace agreements for every trash hauling contract. It's, as I read the memo, I thought it was permissive and optional. As I read the statutory language, it doesn't read as permissive or optional. And I assume that the advocates for this in the organized labor will take us to court. I mean, why wouldn't they? If they win passage of this. So the ultimate effect of this is that a labor peace agreement would govern every trash hauling contract. That logic would dictate. Step one, law requires DEP director must determine whether the absence of strikes or lockouts are in the public interest. I can't imagine anyone thinking that strikes or lockouts are in the public interest. They would be disruptive to trash pickup. They would not be, a good thing. So I can't imagine a finding to the contrary. And then you have to, presumably because the law requires it, you've got to show that you complied with the law. So the director duly complies with the law and comes to the chief administrative officer, and it's hard to imagine any other recommendation but that a labor peace agreement would be in the public interest. And then the chief administrative officer would bear the onus of disagreeing, right? Or it doesn't seem like it's purely optional on the part of the chief administrative officer, despite the absence of despite the presence of the word if.
The procurement director makes a decision based on the factors listed on lines 89 through 96.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that it's the procurement director and not the DEP director. That's helpful.
It's procurement. And
Yep.
then the director then the decision of the director needs to get approved by the CEO, and the CEO would look at the same factors, would make a decision, a de novo decision on the same factors. It wouldn't be based on, there's not going to be an administrative hearing, an adjudicatory hearing on whether this should be a labor peace agreement. It's going to be a a decision based on the factors by the procurement director that's easily reversible by the chief administrative officer if in fact the procurement director decides to do it. I don't agree with your determination that this has to result in a labor peace agreement in each contract. It depends on what how long the contract is, what would be the disruption in services. I mean, we've had trash hauling contracts for a long time. I don't
And we
exactly
had
know how
two- two
many years.
disruptive
and we've
labor
had
actions.
2 disruptive strikes that didn't last. Neither of them last very long. You know, if in fact the history starts to show that these have never occurred, you know, or that was an those were the blips in the world, and it's not something that's going to happen on a regular basis. It's not even likely to happen. Then there wouldn't be any reason to do a labor peace agreement. Your answer as to why would you not require a labor peace agreement is the procurement director has to think about, is this going to scare away some bidders? And is this going to, you know, make it less competitive? That's why you wouldn't necessarily want to do it automatically.
But the bill doesn't, that's not one of the criteria. The effect on competitiveness isn't included here as to those criteria the director has to look at.
Yeah, we could add that. It's probably a good idea.
Okay, but it's before the full council now.
Well,
I mean, I would like to see amendments to clarify that the wages must be passed through to the employees, because I don't think that's clear here. And I would wonder if my colleagues would be amenable to including the issue of the competitiveness of the contract as one of the things the director must consider. Because on its face, if you have an agreement between the employer and the worker that there's no strike and no lockout, on its face, that's a good thing. You wouldn't want strikes, you wouldn't want lockout. But the negative effect is what Mr. Drummer just alluded to, is that of what we now have is 9 of our 15 trash hauling contracts are presently not awarded to companies whose workforce is organized. Now, perhaps it was the intent to restrict trash hauling contracts only to organized labor. I don't know, but that wasn't stated as the intent. And if you restricted trash hauling contracts, as the initial bill would do, only to, or contracts of more than $250,000, only to those with labor peace agreements, the effect of that, it seems to me, is to restrict these contracts only to companies whose workers have elected a union, because who else would you negotiate with? You can't negotiate a labor peace agreement with an unorganized workforce. But if that's the intent, then that's the intent. But it isn't explicitly stated. And if the director, in making this determination, must consider whether competition is healthy, I don't see that in the bill either. And I just want to say, I think that, look, I, too, was contacted by constituents and by the workers' representatives during the time of the labor friction in the Potomac disposal contract. And I commend my colleagues for seeking to use our power as legislators to make sure that doesn't happen again. Trash collection is a fundamental service. It's absolutely essential. It has to happen at least once a week. If it doesn't happen, it's a big problem. It's a public health problem, sanitation problem, convenience, aesthetics, everything. I'm all in favor of avoiding strikes or lockouts in the future, absolutely. I think this bill has some unforeseen problems in it. If it was the explicit intent to say that from now on trash hauling will only be carried out by an organized workforce, that's not clear either. And if I were the procurement director, I would be confused by this bill. It wouldn't clarify for me what my duties are when a new contract comes up for bidding. It's not clear. The written criteria, it seems to me, lean heavily in the direction of you ought to have a labor peace agreement. If you're basing it on these criteria, it seems to me a labor peace agreement would be the outcome. And then that would put the chief administrative officer in a difficult situation where he or she may open up the county to lawsuit if he doesn't comply, because the law doesn't provide a clear criteria for the chief administrative officer. On what basis does he or she not accept the recommendation of the director? So these are issues I think would merit from a little more attention. This is well intended. I think we may be making some decisions that ultimately will significantly drive up the cost of government. And if we end up excluding 9 of 15 current contractors, are we not exposing ourselves there? I mean, if we basically steer all of these contracts in the direction of an organized workforce, which is what I think this bill does that expose us legally, Mr. Drummer? If from now on every round of trash hauling contracts are awarded to companies who are able to negotiate a labor peace agreement, meaning that there are representatives of the employees chosen by the employees, meaning that they are union companies, have we not then created an uncompetitive situation where not all companies can bid for trash hauling contracts?
Well, if that's the result, we have certainly hurt competition for these contracts.
And would that not open up the county to litigation?
No, because, I mean, you're not, if in fact you said you can only bid on the contract if you had a union representing your employees, that would probably be, that I'm pretty sure would be preempted by the National Labor Relations Act. That would be trying to regulate labor relations. And employees have a right to join or not join a union under federal law. So you couldn't do that. If the result is that, I think it would be a hard argument to make that this labor peace agreement is the only reason to do it, is the only reason that happened. You know, a non-union contractor could actually comply with this either by not having a union that actually asks for a labor peace agreement, or negotiating an agreement with a union that is trying to organize its employees, but it never actually manages to organize its employees. It doesn't guarantee that the employees will join the union or vote for the union, and that's covered totally under federal labor law. It certainly would make it a non-union shop think twice about bidding on our contract, I would think. But we haven't really heard from the non-union shops.
Okay, I'm going to restate before I yield. I would ask my colleagues if they would consider clarifying two issues that seems to me are lacking here. The first issue is I don't see where the bill ensures that the cost increase is passed through as a wage increase. I don't see where the bill guarantees that that takes place. And we've seen some of the operators of these trash hauling companies, and any company owner likely would seek to maximize his or her profits if he's guaranteed a price increase, and would not necessarily pass those through to the employees. So if there's no appetite to take up any amendments or on this, then there's no appetite. But it seems to me that that's lacking. There is not a guarantee here that the employees actually get the wage increase that the sponsors seek. That's number one. Number two, Mr. Drummer just said it would be a good idea to add as a criterion the effect on competitiveness of requiring a labor peace agreement, but that's not in the bill. And all of the things on lines 86 through 95 that the procurement director must consider, it seems to me, argue for a labor peace agreement. And if we're seeking labor peace agreements for every one of these contracts, that's not clearly stated in the bill, and as Mr. Drummer says, that may run afoul of the National Labor Relations Act. The effect of that would surely be that there would no longer be competition from other than non-union companies, if that's what we seek. Maybe that's what the sponsors are seeking. I'm not sure, but as I read this, these are the questions that came to my mind. I'll yield.
Are you making a motion, keep talking about
well, I don't have.
He's not made a motion at this time.
These are well.
Are you just pontificating, or are you putting a motion out for the purview of the
Craig here.
Sure, Mr. Rice.
Thank you.
I don't have language that would ensure that the wage increase is passed through to the employees. I would move, sure, that we seek language that ensures that the recipient of the cost increase must pass it through to the employees. That's going to have to be drafted, and it isn't ready this morning. If it's the will of the council to push this bill through this morning, it's not ready. But I'll make the motion. Can I get a second, Mr. Rice? Okay. Okay. All right. And the second point is that we add a criterion that states that, again, I haven't drafted the language, but that one of the criteria that the director must determine is whether requiring a labor peace agreement would ensure competitiveness for the county of these contracts. Can I get a second for that?
I'll second that, but let me just clarify.
If I could just clarify, Councilmember Leventhal, on page 5, line number 96 says, any other factors affecting the public interest. A competitive bid is in the public interest. Now, again, if we need to tighten that up with language saying competitive bid, there's no issue with that. It's already included in there. I would assume that any person who's actually doing this and evaluating this as a director would certainly think about competitiveness as a part of an evaluation affecting the public interest. But to clarify that, I don't have an issue with that and would second that as well.
Okay, fine. So we'll need to get those drafted, and how long would it take then before the council could act?
So, Mr. Leventhal,
I mean, we have to vote.
circle page 5, item A, determination. Are you suggesting that there be a number 6 that says the competitiveness of the market or the contracts? Is that?
Mr. Drummer suggested that there should be language added that the procurement director must consider competitiveness in awarding contracts as one of the determinations before determining whether a labor peace agreement is in the best interest of the county. That was, I asked whether that was there, and Mr. Drummer said that would be a good idea. So I've moved that, and Mr. Rice has seconded that. I don't have the precise language in front of me.
All right. So, Mr. Drummer, any comment here? But we would need to prepare some language, so we're going to have to come back to this. But first, we'll have to decide if this amendment is accepted. Is there any objection to this amendment? To these? Well, is there any objection to the First Amendment? Okay.
Yeah, I just have a comment. Well, I will be very curious to see what you come up with in terms of ensuring that the money and the increase goes to the employees, because we've had this conversation on GO ad nauseum, not just with this particular bill, but with the previous bill. And you, Mr. Drummer, were, you were the person who has been staffing us. So I'm going to be really curious as the chair of this committee where we have asked for this language over and over and over again. And what you gave us is what you thought was permissible. It would be interesting for me to see what you come up with. Because again, it's not as if this has not been a point of contention and inquiry for not just this one, but a previous one. So.
All right. So so the cost increase issue, except with that, is before us. Is there any? Yeah, well, I think we should speak to the amendments, because the amendments have been offered. So it's time to speak to the amendments. So, yes. Are we coming back to the amendments this afternoon? Well, I think that's sort of the next question. I'm sort of thinking out loud here. I think we will have to come back to this.
You might draft the amendments
and
have us look at them and comment on them this afternoon.
Right.
My guess is they'll be fine, but I think it's in all of our interest to comment, to be able to read amendments before we vote on them.
Oh, absolutely.
Can we continue the discussion, since we have a queue?
Yeah.
It's a suggestion. I think these amendments are perfectly benign.
All right. It sounds like we will hit pause on this. We'll get some language from council staff. If we can return to this in the afternoon, we will. If we have it ready, we'll return to it this afternoon.
Right, right. Because there may be more amendments or not. Right.
Some people want to comment on this topic, which I think is fine at this moment, because we're in this discussion, so why have to reset? So,
My next.
people were already in the line for the bill in general. And I think we'll go to you, Tom.
Yep. Yep.
Thank you, Council President. Yes, a lot has been said about this bill, and the bill, I think, was originally drafted in February, so my memory is at least imperfect, and a lot of time has gone by. But just to clarify, we've heard a lot of concerns about the bill. Getting the impression the trash was reliably picked up a couple years ago in Garrett Park, but I can tell you thousands of us in Silver Spring and Bethesda suffered with no trash pickup for weeks, and it was a huge problem. And plenty of people who don't pay attention to this council on any other day really were wondering why we didn't have a solution in place. And in the years that have gone by, I haven't seen any other bill to address that problem and guarantee our ability to deliver this critical service. So Ms. Florine asked, what's the point of the bill? The reason for the bill is to provide the county, and more importantly the public, an additional layer of reliability that we will be able to deliver a critical service where we can't tolerate work stoppages and strikes and efforts. Efforts that we had 2 years ago to eliminate a union that employees had voluntarily chosen to vote for. I appreciate Mr. Leventhal's comments that this is a well-intentioned bill and that we can't tolerate any strikes or work stoppages in this area in the future. The history and context is important. We have 666 service contracts, and as the packet says, we only have a history of strikes and work stoppages in this area. And it's troubling that this comes not in an area of service delivery that's sort of optional or doesn't have any urgency, but is in an area that no constituent wants us to, where no constituent wants us to fall down on the job. So that's what this bill is intended to address. Again, it's only enabling, so it only takes effect if the procurement director uses this power, if they choose to use this power. It's one more tool in their tool.
Procurement director must.
If. It's there in black and white.
No, if is the CAO. The procurement director must.
If the director finds that a labor peace provision is the best interest of the county.
Okay.
So anyway, you can suggest an amendment, but that's the best Mr. Drummer could do, and we all voted, I mean, the GO committee voted unanimously that made them confident that this was an enabling bill. But the goal is to give them one more tool in their toolbox. And to your point, Mr. Leventhal, that this is going to steer every contract to a union. It may or may not. We have some union contractors. We have some non-union contractors right now picking up our trash, and the trash delivery has been relatively reliable. We want to make sure there's not a lack of reliability in the future. My guess is if we pass this bill and our contractors know the procurement director has the power to require a labor peace provision in the future, they will treat their employees better and they will do a better job of guaranteeing service delivery. This came up when one of our contractors tried to bust the union that was already out there and deny them health care, and those drivers understandably quit their jobs, didn't finish their routes, and went to a better company. That's exactly what we want to be able to prevent in the future, because we can't allow a failure of service delivery. This bill is not a panacea to fix all the challenges in our procurement department. We have a director of procurement whose job is to ensure Ms. Florine is, or Ms. Navarro, the chairwoman, is completely correct that this was asked and we thought answered in the work session that I know I raised. How are we going to make sure that workers get the raise that's intended to them under this bill? And the answer was, we're going to do it the way we do all the time, by auditing our certified payroll records, the same way we enforce the living wage law and the prevailing wage law and the minimum wage law and anything else. We have that authority right now without the bill. We have that authority under the bill as well. And that's the job of the procurement director. And there's nothing in here that automatically increases the costs. We may find more competition under this because there are maybe other companies that bid now that don't bid for Montgomery County contracts without such an assurance. So anyway, that's my effort to address some of the things that have been, the questions that have been raised about the intent of the bill and the desired outcome. I think the amendments that Mr. Leventhal suggests, while I haven't seen them in writing, sound fine and consistent with the intent of the bill, and I look forward to seeing them this afternoon.
Mr. Rice.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I just want to echo everything that Councilmember Hucker has said. I think that he gave a great summary. The reason why I seconded both amendments is because I think they're benign. I think that they speak to the spirit of what the bill already has. I would say one thing that's very interesting. When I read the labor peace agreement determination starting on lines 86, to me it actually is a deterrence from using union contractor. If a director has to determine all of these things that are happening, an adverse financial or economic impact of a disruption of service, the cost associated with finding replacement services if something were to happen, the risk of disruption of services, a history of strikes or lockouts disrupting county services, all of this speaks to why would I want to do business with anyone who has all of these potential negative outcomes, even if I had to solve it by doing a labor peace agreement? And shouldn't I look at an entity that doesn't have all of these things in it, a private company, who has a history of providing reliable service, doesn't have any service interruption issues, and pays its employees well? Don't tell me they're not out there. They exist too. And so from that perspective, it's the reason why we do business with them now as a county. So, you know, to answer the question about, well, you know, is this going to take away business from folks who are non-union? I don't think so, or else we wouldn't be doing business with them now, unless our procurement director is doing something adverse to what they think is in the best interest of the county. And so if we're not doing anything wrong now when it comes to ensuring that we focus on reliability and cost affordability and quality of service, those things aren't changing as a result of this bill. What I think is happening is that what we're doing is tightening this up to say, if in fact we're doing business with a company who does have a union, let's make sure that we don't have to worry about the adverse possibilities that may exist as a result of doing business with a company who doesn't have these protections in place for its employees. It's an interesting one because I think it all depends on how you are looking at the situation, through what lens. And as a person who comes from a private sector background, primarily Marriott, who had a stance on unions, I can tell you that it's an interesting one for me, in which I read this completely differently from what I've heard this morning in terms of where the focus would be. I will just say one thing, Councilmember Leventhal, and I'm a person, again, who looks at every single word. It's my Annapolis training that's done it to me, but you keep saying must determine. A must determine does not mean that an assumption of moving forward is there. And I understand that you're saying that, well, if they consider all of these things, then it's, precluded that, yes, they're going to go in that direction. But I don't see it that way at all. In fact, I see it as must determine as, look, I need to decide if this is going to be good for the county or not. And in addition, I have to decide all these negative things that may result from me going in this direction, and how I could then try to ameliorate the situation based on all of these things by doing a labor peace agreement. In my mind, if I have to do all this extra stuff to ensure that the same thing would happen with someone else, if the prices are the same and competitive, I might go the other direction. So I don't necessarily see it the same as you do. And then to add another layer on top of that, to where then the CAO, who again is working for the county executive, who also has the best mind or has the intent of making sure that we're focusing on the best interests of the public, who makes that ultimate decision. There have been plenty of times, and Bonnie's sitting in the audience, she can tell you, I know, to where the CAO decides something different from a director. Happens all the time. So why would we assume that in this case it would be something different is far beyond me. I think that this bill is something that, again, allows for us with some of our union contractors to have continuity of service, to make sure that their employees are paid and that they're doing what they need to, not only to make sure that their company is strong, because that's important, but also make sure that their employees are protected. And so that's the reason why I signed on as a co-sponsor of this legislation. I think that, again, what it does is it ensures that when we're looking at what's happening in our county, that we have consistency and we have fairness. And those are things that I think all of our residents would want to see for us. Thank you.
Ms. Fleury.
Thank you. Before I get to the point I was going to make, just in response to Councilmember Rice, look, I understand everyone's trying to be well-meaning here, but I think this sends the opposite message. If I'm a hauler, I'm going to be wondering why I'm doing business in Montgomery County, pure and simple. You're just loading on. People continue to have jobs. It's worth thinking about. The more rules you add, the harder it is to work here. But I wanted to allude to something else. Turns out I'm not the only one worried about the price increase issue. A county executive apparently sent you, the committee, a memo on this last month. Guess we forgot to put in the packet, that raises the very issues I had been raising about the built-in increases. And he reminds us that the cost of our contracts in fiscal 17 were $23 million. In 19, we're estimating $30 million. So
that was, Ms. Fleury, if I may.
Oh, well, I'm just reading what was provided.
We received that before the committee.
Well, I know you did. It wasn't in the packet,
Some
though.
of the change, okay, it wasn't in the packet for the full council?
Yeah, I never saw it before. So now I've seen it. Thank you, Ms. Kirkland, for drawing my attention to that. So I'm not alone in being concerned
Absolutely.
about the price issue. Adding language about more standards gets you someplace, I guess. But at the end of the day, there's actually nothing in any of this that addresses reliability. For everyone's reference to that term, that's not the driving force in any of this. Nor is competitiveness the driving force, nor is affordability relevant. We should worry about the people who have to pay this bill, just as much as we worry about the haulers. And if the price goes up and up and up, let's be honest about it. And if we don't ensure reliability at the end of the day in any contract, that issue is going to continue to be an issue for any community that is subject to this proposal. So apparently the staff had recommended removing the mandatory increases. Was that right?
Well, we did.
The staff, Mr. Drummer, is that what you all had recommended?
Yes.
Yes, but the committee chose not to do that.
We did remove that, actually. The whole contract is no longer subject to a mandatory CPI adjustment as originally proposed. That was removed, and
But
a
what
much
is mandatory
narrower
is
provision.
that an increase in wages up to whatever the county general increase will be mandatory.
Well, it's only enabling.
No,
Well,
the mandatory price increase is, the price increase provision is mandatory.
Price increase provision is mandatory.
If
there's a labor peace agreement.
If there's a labor, but it's not the CPI of the whole contract that is.
No.
It's only the portion.
Only a price increase to cover the wage increases
Only the
provided
price
to the
increase.
employees working on the contract.
So
And that part is mandatory.
If you have a labor peace
if
agreement.
you have a labor peace agreement.
If you have a labor peace agreement. Well, that had been my question previously. But the price increase is mandatory if there is a labor peace agreement. I was told that the minimum price increase provision was separate from the labor peace agreement.
It is separate, but it's tied into the labor peace agreement. If you look on page circle 2, if I misrepresented that, I apologize in talking to you, but it says
A midterm contract with a-
multi-term contract with a labor peace provision required by Section 11B89
Must include
must include a price increase.
Must include the price increase.
Yes.
That's a given. So that's my point. Thank you. We're serving the public here. That's our job. I don't see that happening.
Thank you, Ms. Fleury. I just wanted to observe, as a participant in the discussion, the number that we received about the potential cost of this was a number based on all contracts increasing at the CPI. We really narrowed it substantially only to trash sanitation contracts, and then we further made it only for those with a labor peace agreement. And one of the things that came up during the committee meeting that I focused on myself was that we have a living wage requirement in the county for contracts. And so because many of these employees in this industry are near or at the living wage, they would already have an increase built into the contract, or to the extent that they get a CPI bump, which is common, it is for that purpose. And so the procurement department would need to ensure that we aren't double paying, because if they get a CPI bump for their for the fact that the living wage is going up, we don't need to give them the same money again to meet the terms of this legislation. So you're really talking about the delta between what a negotiated agreement might be and what the living wage increase was for that year. And so the amount of money we're talking about narrows really. It narrows. So I concluded that fiscally this was not a significant issue, but that was my conclusion. I don't know that everyone reached that conclusion.
Well, if I could just reclaim the floor, because I raised this issue, that's what the county executive told us. Basically, without any of this, already the price of trash hauling and recycling, I'll just read it, have risen from $23 million in fiscal 17 to an estimated $30 million in fiscal 19. Math-wise, that's a 30% increase. That's a lot already. So you're building something else in. Already, it seems to me like it's a pretty sensitive negotiation occurring.
Thank you, Ms. Fleury. Mr. Elrich.
Just a couple of things, and I think addressing George's point about the uncertainty of what will get passed through. In Ike's letter, he says the terms and conditions of each and every county contract permit a vendor to seek an adjustment when the vendor is able to substantiate increased costs. Trash hauling and recycling contracts either have 5-year term with 2 1-year extensions or optional extensions, or a 7-year contract with 2 1-year optional extensions. In the last 7 years, every time the 3 trash and recycling vendors under contract with the county sought a CIP increase with the supporting documentation, the request was granted. So we already have a procedure. It's already in their contracting provisions that they have to actually document their CIP increases. And so you wouldn't get a CIP increase for wages if you couldn't document that you had paid the wages.
Mr. Elrich, please keep reading to the next paragraph, which directly addresses your point.
But that's the CPI increase, which we removed the CPI increase. I mean, that's what's different about this. It's limited to the increase in our contracts. It's not a blanket CPI increase. And, some years we're below CPI, and I anticipate that given what we know about the budget going forward, contracts aren't going to go above CPI. You will be lucky to hit CPI. As far as the $23 million to $30 million increase, you have no idea, we have no idea of what caused the increase. It could have been fuel costs. I mean, I fully expect, given what's happened in the last year with gas prices, that people are going to say our fuel costs went up dramatically over the last year, and nobody's going to quibble about that being passed on in a contract. Nobody's going to say I'm worried about the increased costs. If a hauler says my costs went up, we're going to say, yes, I recognize that the cost of gas went up, and I expect that to be passed on. I'm sure nobody on the council would say, oh, no, we're not going to pass this on because, it's a big increase. I mean, they would go out of business for that reason as much as they go out of business for any other cost they can't recover. So I think the executive is going to have to, any executive is going to have to continue current procurement policies, and we'll know whether or not these things are in the contracts. And Hans's point is a good one. Everybody has to start with the living wage. And the living wage went up, and I just take note that it went from, I think it was $14.55 to $14.75 this year. And that's almost a 2% increase. It's a little bit less than a 2% increase. So these increases are happening anyway. And so the delta between a CPI increase, not a CPI increase, the delta between what our contracts have been and this kind of increase is going to be small. We're not talking about increases on top of this. We're talking about increases that are part of the lower wage employees. They're going to get an increase either way. And so we're obviously dealing with that either way. There is not supposed to be a scenario where the living wage is not applicable to these employees. So I think that the other point you made may have merit in legislation, but I think we are protected as far as you're concerned about making sure that nobody is able to claim a CPI increase for their company without passing it through to the employees. I think that, as Ike points out, we're protected in that in our contracting.
All right. We are going to have to come back to this bill. We all know we're going to come back to this bill. I think we're going for this afternoon if we have the language ready. But I think it would be helpful to move on to our next items. So I'll ask my colleagues to keep their additional comments with that in mind. Mr. Leventhal.
Okay, I do want to respond to a few of the things that were said. Mr. Rice, you and I do read the language differently. The purpose of a labor peace agreement presumably would be to avoid all those adverse impacts that you read. That if you had a labor peace agreement, you wouldn't have disruption. So you were stating that when you review this list of things and the disruption that might occur, presumably you have a labor peace agreement to avoid disruption. So yes, you and I read that differently. With respect to the GO Committee's chair's comments, and I hope she won't take this the wrong way, it is often the case that a committee gets deep into the weeds on legislation and the other 6 members of the council get up to speed later when it comes before the full council. That was the case when we took up the alcohol measure last week, and it will certainly be the case when we take up the cell towers measure very soon. It's going to take some time. And I just, again, I say this in friendship, but if my good friend, Councilmember Navarro, is finding herself experiencing nausea, I'm sorry about that. I wish her well.
I don't have nausea. I'm
well, you said you had discussed it ad nauseum, so.
Well, my reference was not to you, Mr. Leventhal. It had to do with the very able staff and the fact that we have discussed this, not just for this bill, but a previous bill, displaced worker, and this was a particular point that we went back and forth on trying to find language that would suit it. So this had nothing to do with you.
Okay.
And I've been here since 2009. I understand how the legislative process works. So I'm just saying that I will be very happy and curious to see what we come up with that would be satisfactory, which was language that for some reason we were not able to, the committee was not able to receive on 2 particular bills, including this one.
Reclaiming the floor, as I read what Mr. Drummer wrote, it did not give me confidence that this documentation requirement is there. And in fact, in the county executive's letter, understanding that it's no longer a mandatory annual CPI increase, it is now a mandatory annual increase equal to the amount won by McGeo, I still don't see that the documentation requirement exists. I want to ask, and so I appreciate the statements of my colleagues that my amendment is benign and that as soon as we get it drafted, we'll have something that requires documentation. And then finally, I want to ask, why then are we restricting this mandatory price increase only to those contracts that have labor peace agreements? What's the rationale for that? I don't understand that. Why would we not want all trash haulers to get a wage increase? Why are we limiting it only to those with labor peace agreements? Can somebody explain the rationale for that? I had not focused on that before. It's a complicated bill. And now that I see that, I don't understand why we're doing just that. Why wouldn't we want all trash haulers to get a decent wage?
Mr. Hucker, you're next in line anyway, so, but Mr. Leventhal still has the floor if you'd like to respond to him.
Are you finished with your comments?
I'm asking a question. I'm yielding for an answer to the question. Yeah, I don't understand the rationale. I see now that a multi-term on lines 24 through 26 on Circle 2, a multi-term contract with a labor peace provision must include a price increase provision for each year of the contract.
Right.
Why only those?
I think that might be fine. I might even vote for that. I think you're suggesting a broader bill. This bill was scoped to address a narrow problem, which was a couple of companies that had a history of paying their employees very poorly, and because of that, their employees walking off the job and not picking up trash. We wanted to make sure those employees get a raise. If you want all trash haulers to get a raise, you're the author of your own amendment. You could write it that way, and I'd probably vote for it.
So your answer is then that you're designing this to address the specific situation that arose
This was a narrow,
regarding
targeted
a
bill,
couple of contracts.
and the amendments that were adopted by the committee narrow it even further. So for that reason, that's the answer to your question, I believe, and you're certainly free to amend it any way you want to make it more expansive. But that will, if you have a concern about the cost in the future, that would increase the cost. Now, if the cost is going to low-paid workers, I'd probably be for it again, but that would be the consequence of your amendment, I believe.
I'm simply trying to understand why what was done in committee was done. I'm not offering an amendment at this time.
I think you're full of good ideas. I think you could write that up, seriously.
Okay, I'll yield. Thank you.
Okay. Just on the cost, what I was going to add was I think many of us would support the idea of getting low-paid workers, especially those who have a history of walking off the job when they have a contractual obligation to perform a critical service to the county, a little bit more pay. This council has a history of doing that. But if we're concerned about costs, what costs us money is work stoppages as well, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. What happened last time when we had a work stoppage is we had one contractor making, I believe, a good profit to perform their contractual obligation, but unable to do that because they weren't passing on enough money to their workers, so their workers walked off the job. Then we had to bring in a second contractor from Prince George's County at a premium to do the trash routes and recycling routes and yard waste routes that the first contractor was not performing. So that now we're paying two contractors. And we had to pay our own park and planning staff and their trucks, presumably overtime, to run around and pick up yard waste as well. All that, I'm quite sure, is more gave us more cost than the initial intended cost of the first contract.
All right, Mr. Katz, you have the last question or comment.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. I just wanted to point out, and it's been pointed out in a couple of different ways, but what these contractors are doing, the trash haulers who are picking up the recycling and trash in Montgomery County, are actually saving the money for the residents that they're picking up for. The county does not have to buy trash trucks, which are not inexpensive. I mean, they can be $250,000 or whatever they are per truck. They don't have to have any of the other expenses. There are no additional benefits that the county is paying. They're paying a contract price. And if we want those businesses to stay in business, then we have to make certain that they are getting a fair profit and are paying their employees that fair wage so that that employee will stay. That's what we had many a good conversation. This bill went in a lot of different ways at government operations, and I think everybody sat down and worked together. I think the amendments that are being suggested make a lot of sense. I think that we had discussed it, and if it wasn't clear enough in the final drafts, and let's get that cleaned up. But bottom line is, this is an important function. If we didn't have contractors doing it, Montgomery County would have to go out and buy a whole lot of trash trucks, and that would be a much more expensive proposition for us. So I think we're getting back to where we need to be on this bill. Thank you.
All right. We're going to wrap up this item. I think that we should come back to this next week. I'm sorry. We have a legislative day. It's not that far off. So, all right. We're going to move on to the next items.
So we're not going to do it this afternoon?
No, I don't think we should do this afternoon. I don't want to rush through. I think there's an interesting question that's been raised about whether it should apply to all contracts. Personally, I'd like to think about that. Others have said it's an interesting concept. Why don't we give that some consideration, folks? But that might require some careful thinking. And so I think it's okay if we take a couple days to just give that some thought. All right. Plus, this afternoon, we have a full agenda as well. Okay. Moving on. Hopefully this next item will be less, there will be less discussion. Bill 2818.
Much more.
Boards, committees, and commissions amendments. GO committee recommends enactment. This is a roll call vote. Council Vice President Navarro.
Thank you so much. This is Bill 28-18, Boards, Committees, and Commissions Amendments. And this is a bill that was introduced at the request of the county executive by our council president. GO committee recommended 3-0. Approval is introduced. Basically, it reduces the membership of the Cable and Communications Advisory Committee from 15 members to 9 members. It increases the number of veteran representatives on the Commission of Veteran Affairs and removes the director of the Department of Economic Development from the commission. It changes the name of the Committee on Hate Violence to the Committee Against Hate Violence. And the executive originally transmitted 3 separate bills but agreed to consolidate the bills into one omnibus bill, which is what we have in front of you, and is a roll call vote. Thank you.
All right, Ms. Paradise. Oh, there's a comment. Mr. Leventhal.
As this council winds down, I just want to remind whoever will be here in the next round and whoever will be in the county executive's office, I made some efforts over the years to consolidate the numbers of boards, committees, and commissions. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done there. If we are going to reinvent government, if we're going to try and squeeze savings out of government, if we're going to try and work with staff to ascertain what is the best and highest use of staff time, I just want to tell you, I know well in the HHS arena, but I know it goes well beyond HHS. We have redundancy. We have duplication. We have staff time that is not best used going from one board and commission to another with overlapping missions. It does merit. This is a good bill. I'm all for it. I'm delighted that we're thinking about the names of these commissions. I'm glad that we're clarifying that we're against hate violence. I'm all for this bill. But there's much more work that could be done in the interest of streamlining and squeezing savings out of county government in this area. I was unsuccessful when I brought it up. I brought it up more than once. The members of the boards, committees, and commissions, of course, all believe that they're indispensable, and they testified against any change. We made a few little changes with the local Recreation Advisory Committee. I'm glad that we now have one countywide Recreation Advisory Committee. That was a good change. But there's much more that can be done here. It's a fruitful area for whoever occupies the executive seat and whoever is sitting in these seats in the future. So I hope that this work will continue, and I commend the chair of the GO committee and the committee for its work.
Thank you very much. Ms. Paradise.
Mr. Elrich? Yes. Mr. Elrich votes yes. Mr. Hucker?
Yes.
Oops.
Mr. Hucker votes yes. Mr. Rice?
Yes.
Mr. Rice votes yes. Mr. Berliner?
Yes.
Mr. Berliner votes yes. Mr. Leventhal?
Yes.
Mr. Leventhal votes yes. Ms. Florine? Yes. Ms. Florine votes yes. Mr. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Katz votes yes. Ms. Navarro? Yes. Ms. Navarro votes yes. Mr. Reamer?
Yes, and that is unanimous. And we'll move to our next item, Bill 2318, Fire Safety Carbon Monoxide Alarm. Public Safety Committee recommends enactment with amendments, and this will be a roll call vote. Mr. Elrich.
Mr. Elrich.
Public Safety Committee Chair, legislation on carbon monoxide, 5C. All right, Mr. Rice.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to the Public Safety Committee for their unanimous support of this very important bill. We've had, unfortunately, 2 deaths that have happened right here in Montgomery County due to carbon monoxide poisoning in people's homes, and it really is something that is easily preventable. It's really a great achievement to have our Greater Capital Area Association of Realtors, who partnered with me on this bill, and I really appreciate their support. They understand the importance of making sure that residents are safe, that people as they move into homes are educated about how to keep themselves and their families safe. I really want to thank Amanda Myhill for her great work in working with our partners over at DPS, who made, I think, this bill even stronger and made sure that we were focused on what we needed to focus on, the safety of our residents. You know, we've talked so much about fire safety and about having smoke alarms, and it needs to be a change in conversation to where we start talking about smoke and carbon monoxide detectors. They need to be one in one. They need to be everywhere. It is something that can take your life in a moment's notice while you're sleeping at home in your bed, and it's something that's so easily preventable. And so I really just want to say thank you to the committee. Thank you to, again, all of the partners who worked with me on this. This bill is going to save lives. It really is. And it's not often that we get to say that, but I can feel confident in saying that's going to be the case with this bill. So thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. Ms. Paradise.
Mr. Elrich?
Yes.
Mr. Elrich votes yes. Mr. Hucker?
Yes.
Mr. Hucker votes yes. Mr. Rice?
Yes.
Mr. Rice votes yes. Mr. Berliner? Yes. Mr. Berliner votes yes. Mr. Leventhal?
Yes.
Mr. Leventhal votes yes. Ms. Florine? Yes. Ms. Florine votes yes. Mr. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Katz votes yes. Ms. Navarro?
Yes.
Ms. Navarro votes yes. Mr. Reamer?
Yes, and that is unanimous. And now we will move to expedited bill 2718, development tax, impact tax for transportation improvements, refunds, credits, amendments. GO committee recommends enactment. Council Vice President Navarro.
Thank you. This particular bill, 27-18, taxation, development, impact tax for transportation improvements, refunds, credits, amendments. It was introduced, it was sponsored by lead sponsor, Council President Reamer, at the request of the county executive. The GO committee has voted 3-0 to approve the bill as introduced. This bill will authorize the transportation impact tax credit for certain expenses paid by a property owner for improvements listed in a Unified Mobility Program or the White Oak Local Area Transportation Improvement Program. It extends the time for the county to spend transportation impact taxes to equal the time transportation impact tax credits remain valid, and it changes the time to certified an impact tax credit from the issuance of a building permit to the collection of the impact tax. The GO committee also discussed a particular amendment that was requested by Robert Harris on behalf of his client that would have required impact tax credits for the entire project, reconstructing West Old Baltimore Road in Clarksburg. We did consider this particular request, but concluded that this is an issue that really should, that warrants further investigation, and that the T&E committee should take a look at this. And if it finds the particulars of it, which has a lot to do with how do you define capacity and some of those other types of technical issues related to transportation, that then a separate bill can be drafted and the GO committee can take into consideration the tax issues related to that. So we've asked Dr. Orland to draft a memo specifically describing this request to the chair of the T&E committee so that can be addressed. So with that, we again approved the bill as introduced 3-0.
All right. Not seeing any discussion. Ms. Paradise.
Mr. Elrich?
Yes.
Mr. Elrich votes yes. Mr. Hucker?
Yes.
Mr. Hucker votes yes. Mr. Rice?
Yes.
Mr. Rice votes yes. Mr. Berliner?
Yes.
Mr. Berliner votes yes. Mr. Leventhal?
Yes.
Mr. Leventhal votes yes. Ms. Florine?
Yes.
Ms. Florine votes yes. Mr. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Katz votes yes. Ms. Navarro?
Yes.
Ms. Navarro votes yes. Mr. Reamer?
Yes, and that is unanimous. All right, now we will move on. We are about an hour behind schedule. Next item, council sitting is the Board of Health. This is related to legislation introduced earlier. This is the introduction of a resolution to adopt Bill 3518, Health and Sanitation Smoking Outdoor Serving Areas as a Board of Health Regulation, sponsored by Council Member Katz. And there will be a public hearing scheduled for October 23rd at 1:30 p.m. And now we will move to an item we have discussed many times, and perhaps this will be the last time. For 10 years, yes. Let this one go away for 10 years.
Supposed to be adopted some years ago.
That's true. It is actually several years overdue. So we have action on a resolution to approve the 2017 to 2026 10-year comprehensive water supply and sewage systems plan. I will ask Mr. Levchenko to briefly summarize what we have done, and then we will go to a vote, unless there is discussion. But we had a straw vote on this several weeks ago.
Well, yeah, you had a straw vote on the last remaining set of issues. The council actually did most of the work on this back in April, but was not able to complete the work, and then we brought it back to committee in July, and then back to the full council on September 11th, where the council, as you mentioned, took final straw votes on the remaining issues. So staff is certainly here to answer any questions. I worked with executive staff to finalize language in the plan to accomplish what the council intent has been through these preliminary votes, and clarify language based on, frankly, comments received from council members and also from the public to try to make the document clear in places and consistent. So that's all reflected in the attachments to the resolution here. The only other note I will make is I have recommended that you actually change the date of the plan to reflect 2018 to 2027. That is, you're obviously adopting it in 2018 now. We received it in 2017, so that...
We hope.
I'm being an optimist, but so that obviously we want to be consistent with the dates and move it forward. Just to clarify, in terms of how often we're supposed to do this, it is intended to be every 3 years. This is the first plan that the executive sent over last year's plan update, so we are a bit behind. However, some of the language in the plan also allows for a lot of the technical language to be updated much easier than it has in the past. So we do expect that future updates will be a little smoother. And certainly we've been 15 years between plans, so we expect some difficulty from that as well. So hopefully in the next few years, when the next plan comes up, we won't have to slog through all of the issues we had to slog through this time. But if council members have any specific questions or clarifications they need on any of the policies, the major policies that were discussed, the committee, the council staff packet does try to summarize them very briefly on pages 2 and 3, and then the resolution has attachments with actual language directing the plan to these policies. So staff's open to however council members want to do that if they need to, or if they're ready to vote.
I think we are ready to vote. I think people have talked about this a lot. I don't even hear anyone wants to make any puns about this issue, so that's a real sign. Mr. Elrich.
So I hear the inevitable flushing sound. But I just have a question. So when we initiate a survey, how do people get it? Are there limits on who's included? Now, this is a question that came to me from residents. So what is...
Well, the initial gatekeeper, if you will, of the survey is that the Department of Permitting Services has to identify a documented failure with no reasonable on-site remedy.
Right.
So that's the trigger. And I think folks came to agree on that. Where there was further discussion was, what about the survey itself, which is obviously broader than one property by definition. And in that case, the council's direction a few weeks ago was to allow that survey process to occur as it had been previously drafted, which is you don't absolutely have to have failures on other properties. However, it will be up to DEP, the executive, and the council ultimately to approve that area, if you will, and determine whether those other areas beyond that one failure warrant a special service area or not. So that's going to be done on a case-by-case basis.
So the inclusion in the survey does not predetermine an answer.
Right.
It just says we're going to make decisions case by case.
Right. The survey itself does not guarantee approval down the line. The survey is just the area that DEP and DPS will be reviewing. They may find additional failures. They may find areas with severe constraints. They may find properties that are perfectly fine. And that will guide their recommendations to the executive, who will then transmit that to the council. And it will be up to the council at that point to decide, based on all of their priorities and policy issues, whether the weight of the recommendation is such that that area should be approved as an area, or maybe portions of the area should be approved, or none of it should be approved, other than maybe the documented failure that triggered it.
Right. Well, thank you for clarifying that. I mean, this bill's come a long way, and I will avoid any other pun-making or efforts at humor on this. So I think, not everything is, there are a few things I might have tweaked, but I think this has actually made a lot of progress, and so I'll support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Elrich. And we are ready to vote. We need a motion. It's been moved by Mr. Hucker, seconded by Mr. Berliner. This is a show of hands. All those in favor of this 10-year comprehensive plan, raise your hands. All right. I see Mr. Elrich, Mr. Hucker, Mr. Rice, Mr. Berliner, Ms. Florine, Mr. Katz, Mr. Barrow, myself. All those opposed? Mr. Leventhal. Motion carries 8-1. Or the resolution is passed 8-1. All right. Rolling on through. think we should take the next one out of order and go straight to item D.
They'll just take a minute.
You promise?
Really? Promise.
Okay.
Well, I can never
I just,
promise.
you never, like, you don't know.
Have the need that my colleagues have to weigh in on these things, but if I may.
All right.
Mr. President.
You are the ZTA Meister.
Well, yeah. The Fed Committee, if you'd like, we can take them up in a group. The next three items, 8A, 8B, and 8C, we commend the sponsors of these bills for their brilliance and intelligence and support them all as introduced. Doesn't happen often. The first one has to do, number 8A, has to do with site plan amendment, solar collection systems. We say, good. Councilmember Hucker and Councilmember Leventhal. This one would allow solar collection systems without an amendment to a previously approved site plan with certain constraints. It's a good.
Nicely done. We will need to
That's
vote
the
on them
first one.
separately.
Need to vote on that one.
But appreciate your discussing them. Are there any questions on any item A, B, or C?
I can, let me describe them. That was A.
Thank you. Please do.
B has to do with landscape contractors in the rural cluster zone. This is a project Mr. Hucker and I have been working on in the Burtonsville vicinity, and the solution to a unique property challenge with respect to landscape contractor there. We were advised by Park and Planning that this adjustment to the definitions and zoning text amendment, this particular language would resolve a unique local problem without the need for a master plan amendment. So we did it this way, and there was no objection to that within the committee. And the last one is addressing the need for an incentive for more accessible townhouses or homes. And this makes it easier and supports their production.
Excellent. So these items
So
have
we're
been...
all about moving forward with great ideas.
Wow. New slogan for Montgomery County.
We're working on that.
I will now turn it to Ms. Parrott. Yes. It'll-
Mr. Elrich?
Yes.
Mr. Elrich votes yes.
Three times or one time?
we have to do them one at a time. This is item 1808, CTA 1808.
Mr. Hucker?
Yes.
Mr. Hucker votes yes. Mr. Rice?
Yes.
Mr. Rice votes yes. Mr. Berliner?
Yes.
Mr. Berliner votes yes. Mr. Leventhal? Yes. Mr. Leventhal votes yes. Ms. Florine?
Yes.
Ms. Florine votes yes. Mr. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Katz votes yes. Ms. Navarro? Yes. Ms. Navarro votes yes. Mr. Reamer?
Yes, and that is unanimous. Now, item 1809.
Mr. Elrich?
Yes.
Mr. Elrich votes yes. Mr. Hucker?
Yes.
Mr. Hucker votes yes. Mr. Rice?
Yes.
Mr. Rice votes yes. Mr. Berliner?
Yes.
Mr. Berliner votes yes. Mr. Leventhal?
Yes.
Mr. Leventhal votes yes. Ms. Florine? Yes. Ms. Florine votes yes. Mr. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Katz votes yes. Ms. Navarro? Yes. Ms. Navarro votes yes. Mr. Reamer?
Yes, and that is unanimous. And now, item 1810.
Mr. Elrich?
Yes.
Mr. Elrich votes yes. Mr. Hucker?
Yes.
Mr. Hucker votes yes. Mr. Rice?
Yes.
Mr. Rice votes yes. Mr. Berliner? Yes. Mr. Berliner votes yes. Mr. Leventhal?
Yes.
Mr. Leventhal votes yes. Ms. Florine?
Yes.
Ms. Florine votes yes. Mr. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Katz votes yes. Ms. Navarro? Yes. Ms. Navarro votes yes. Mr. Reamer?
Yes, and that is unanimous.
The fourth item, however,
Yeah, the fourth item.
I
May
will
involve some discussion.
return to your court.
Thank you. Thank you, Committee Chair Lorraine. Boy, that displaced service thing kind of wiped me out. Here we go. So we are now returning to an item that we have discussed, and we will have more discussion today and then vote. We have some amendments to further, hopefully, reach consensus or as close to as possible. And I will describe the amendments in a moment, but I will just briefly ask Mr. Zients to summarize where we are here in our dialogue. Thank you.
The Fed committee had recommendations that went forward, and the council had discussed amending those per proposals by Council Member Reamer. All of those amendments go toward increasing the connection to locally grown agriculture and what you have to do on site, and addressing some of the issues with event size and how those should be limited. Now there's two different categories of events. One is normal and customary events, festival type things, and they are not proposed for limitation. It was proposed with a 9-event limit per year with more than 300 guests. That is the subject of possible amendments. Certainly, Councilmember Reamer wanted to put that limit at 225, but would only limit those things in that were not agriculturally related, something in the nature of corporate retreats and other events and products. Now, as I understand it, Councilmember Reamer is proposing further amendments from what were in my packet with regard to events.
So I'll describe that when the time is ready.
Okay. The other aspect of amendments is how much of on-site growing you would have to do to qualify for an accessory agricultural production. And right now for wineries, there's a requirement that at least 5 acres of grapes or fruit be grown on site. That was not in the ZTA as introduced. Councilmember Reamer would allow for wineries 5 acres either on site or in abutting or confronting rented property grown in grapes. The other thing that was agreed to was the conditions that are required for a Class 4 alcohol production license. That would mean the need for at least 20 acres total of locally grown grapes, or now I forgot the other exclusion for that, but some at least grown in a grapes grown in the area or something. I have to refresh my recollection.
Okay, you're going to talk about that? Okay.
Or a source of majority grapes or other fruit grown in Maryland, which is the current requirement. I don't think there are any changes proposed to that provision. With the amendments, it keeps the provisions that were there, all on-site parking on-site, limitation on the foot candles you can put to other land uses. It limits noise as by the noise standards in Chapter 31B. And Council Reamer proposes one other addition, is that in the AR zone, the minimum site area for breweries and distilleries would be 25 acres.
All right. Thank you. You've talked long enough for all of us to compose ourselves, take a breath, and get ready.
That was the idea.
Well done.
I also, if Council Member, if you get to your proposal that I saw today, I have some
Yeah.
drafted language that you could.
Thank you. You have some drafted language. Terrific. If you could, well, I will.
I gave it.
So I wanted to take the opportunity here to just describe the additional change. It is, I had proposed in the amendment in the packet that events would just be limited to the size of the facility that the owner has built. I've heard from some owners that creates some significant issues, and so I recommend that we go back to the approach that I had previously on the event sizes in the packet last week, which is as follows, that there, and I've distributed to my colleagues an email that was emailed around on Friday and Monday with this information, but that, these are the events that we would consider accessory events to the winery, brewery, distillery, cidery, accessory to the accessory, and that they would be unlimited for events with fewer than 100 people. There would be 50 allowed between 100 and 225 people, and no accessory events larger than that, unless a conditional use is granted by the hearing examiner. So moved. Thank you. Thank you. Moved and seconded. Now, the amendments that are in the packet also, I believe, need to be moved and seconded. But those include an amendment. Sure. Well, can we take them up one at a time? Yeah. Okay. Good. So we'll start with the events issue, and we can discuss this question. I have another sheet that I've passed around which highlights the distinction between accessory events and normal and customary events. So I really want to draw this distinction because it's important. A normal and customary event is one that is really closely related to the production of the farm-based alcohol. So for example, in the case of a winery, it is a grape crush event, grape stomp, or with a brewery, it might be a tasting. It is not a music festival. A music festival is not normal and customary to the manufacturer and sale of this product. It is a music event. It's really selling music and that whole event experience. So a music event festival is something we want to limit under the accessory events category, whereas the release of a new vintage or something like that is considered normal and customary to the operation of the business. So that is the distinction between the two. The accessory events have, I think, pretty strict limits that I've proposed to Councilmember Rice, and I really want to thank Councilmember Rice for partnering with me on this. It's been very helpful. You have really carried a lot here. So thank you. And so again, you have what we've recommended, Mr. Rice and I, is that that events that are not closely related to agriculture and the production of farm-based alcohol, such as weddings, corporate retreats, birthday parties, music festivals, these are limited. Under 100 people, you can do what you want. I think that's the size of a sizable Christmas party at a person's residence, frankly. But between 100 and 225, you only get 50, and there's none larger than that. So to this particular item, or if anyone wants to comment in general as well. Mr. Rice.
Oh, no. And if I may, just to help out the record here, this would be an amendment to section 3.2.10B2 small a IV. Subsection A. It would now read, except as allowed under subsection C, and subsection C is the conditional use provisions. The maximum number of participants at any event is 225. There is no limit to the number of events with less than 100 participants. The total maximum number of days of events in a calendar year is 50 for events with more than 100.
Mr. Elrich.
So I'd asked at the last time we discussed this that there be a temporary limit at 25 for a couple of years until we review it.
and then see what the impact is. And I thought that was sort of, there was a lot of nodding that that wasn't an unreasonable thing. I understand Mr. Berliner is going to speak to this later, but I wanted to mention this now since this is the appropriate time, and I hope, Roger, you talk soon about what it is you want to, what you're willing to put into a bill, which makes me more comfortable. So I want people to know why I will be more comfortable.
Is this specifically on the events issue? All right, well, we have a motion that has been seconded on, the specific tiering that is before you, so, what's that, Mr. Rice? All right, so we'll just accept that before the body without objection.
The other thing I would mention for the...
Except what?
I'm not following, to be honest, I'm not quite sure what Mr. Elrich has...
Well, are we accepting what you're not
stated
sure of
and we're waiting
without
for him to-
exception, or the earlier comment without? What, Mr. Well,
No.
well, that's what I was just trying to be clear about. And is that, Mr. President, could you just be clear? So you're saying that we should accept Mr. Rice and Mr. Harker's correction?
Without
Fine.
objection.
Thank you.
Mr. Elrich has not yet made a motion.
And I wasn't making a motion because Roger was going to speak to something.
Right, he's highlighting an issue, and it will come up later.
One other thing on events is what is being added is the requirement for a log so that DPS could actually count these events.
Thank you. All right, there are several other amendment items that I'm recommending. The next one I'll bring up is regarding ingredients, and this is, I think, one of the most important and most challenging parts of this discussion, and we're looking for a balance here between market realities and our policy objectives for the agricultural reserve. And requirements around ingredients are intended to help really demonstrate and to ensure that the operation of a business is accessory to farming. It's part of that philosophical and regulatory approach. So what I've put forward is that the breweries and distilleries will have at least 1 acre of ingredients cultivated on site. Wineries are subject to a 5-acre minimum, and then they're also subject to state law, which has a 20-acre owned or controlled and 51% or 51% of grapes from Maryland. So there's 2 tierings of requirements for wineries, and our bill sort of is belts and suspenders by mentioning what the states are and replicating them.
And the only thing I would say is that the 5 acres of fruits need not be grown on site, but can be on, as proposed, can be on abutting or confronting property that's rented.
Good point. So we need a motion for that.
So moved.
All right, been moved and seconded. And now discussion to the ingredients item. Mr. Ellis.
Yeah.
Mr. Rice moved it, Mr. Leventhal seconded. Thank you.
So I still have a problem with the ingredients part, and it's a 2-part problem. One is we talked about having a plan, and this doesn't specify what the plan is. Are there any minimum requirements for the plan, and particularly, is there any minimum requirements for when the plan specifies that production will be phased in?
If I may, the requirements for a plan were slightly amended. This is on lines 94 to 97. It no longer says long-range plans. It says a plan and with a schedule to increase local production. So there's been 2 elements to try to tighten that.
Right. So with the schedule, could be a 2-year schedule, a 5-year schedule, a 10-year schedule.
Yes.
And so I don't think that's actually adequate, particularly when we're not requiring very many acres to come on their production. So I would suggest a shorter frame, and a frame that was suggested to me was a 3-year, schedule. So I don't know why we can't require something within 3 to 5 years to bring the farm into production. I also think the 1 acre is too low, though I would say, for example, we've been told there's a malting facility that's going to happen, and the malting facility would change the viability of barley, and barley being a principal ingredient of beer, that would go a long way to facilitating local production. And so what I'd like to suggest is we really focus on 5 acres, allow the Department of Agriculture, Jeremy Chris, to make a finding that if it's not feasible to do 5 acres at the moment, that the ultimate goal is 5 acres, and allow that department to, when a facility comes online, to, by regulation, increase the requirement up to 5 acres for people who weren't able to make it originally. I really think that if we're going to do this as an accessory to agriculture and encourage farm products, we ought to really say at least 5 acres like we've done for wine, and 5 acres ought to be easy for barley. I mean, I don't think anybody would even satisfy their needs with 5 acres. They're going to be buying barley from somebody else in addition anyway. But I would really like to see us move toward a certain time scale of implementation, a slightly greater requirement of acreage, but give the department flexibility
So
to
you're
approve
saying
it.
that, what would be the requirement? It would say up to 5, it would say
5 acres unless the department determines that it's not feasible for that farmer at this point, but that the department has the ability to go back and say, markets, your point was that the market may not be there. When the market's there, we ought to be able to say this is matured, and so we expect you to turn, up to 5 acres, or 5 acres into production for your product. So it's not hard and fast in saying do something now. If you grew barley today, you couldn't malt it, and that'd be kind of pointless. And it may be impossible to grow enough herbs over 5 acres to justify what you're going to do in brewing, but there's certainly going to come a time when this department may be able to say, hey, you can do 5 acres, and I think we ought to try to wrap this as tightly around agriculture as we can.
Mr. Zients, can you comment on how that could be expressed?
I mean, it would be lines 91 to 93 on circle page 8. It would be at least 5 acres of ingredients grown on site for agricultural process unless the Office of Agriculture determines that that is unfeasible.
Yeah, okay, we have a request to hear from the industry on that. I think that's a good idea. So, Mr. Chris, you'll come join us. Jessica, would you like to come down?
Good afternoon, County Council members. Jeremy Chris, Office of Agriculture. We actually have been talking about the number of acres that would work for farm breweries and farm distilleries. I would say that 1 acre is going to be a challenge for some of our folks to have production. 5 acres is going to be a real challenge. I think that there's a huge opportunity before us. We're seeing operations that are new. We're seeing operations that are under construction. And I'm afraid that we really don't want to have a threshold that's going to discourage this kind of innovative type of farming. So I think the 1 acre that's cited now on line 91 is acceptable. I agree with Councilmember Ehrlich that we should look for additional expansion of products over time, but I'm not sure if we're ready for that now.
I didn't suggest now. I said, if you determine that it's not ready for it now, then you just say it's not ready for it now. But if you're wanting to encourage this kind of innovative farming, farming is rarely defined as a 1 acre farm. We define a farm as 25 acres for one thing. So I don't see how we can't get there later. And if there's no goal to get there later, then we may not ever get there later. But if there's a goal to get there later, I think you'll get there later.
I believe that over time we're going to see an expansion of different types of products being grown for this industry. I honestly believe that. Farmers are going to respond to market forces. This zoning text amendment represents an opportunity for farmers to look at different types of things to produce. I would just encourage the council to take one step at a time and not create a requirement that would discourage an owner to go down this path to develop a farm alcohol production business in Montgomery County.
Thank you, Mr. Chris. Mr. Addix, would you please join us as well? You're the Executive Director of the Brewers Association of Maryland, Grow, Fortify, and you're aware of what other jurisdictions have done around local ingredient requirements and what impact that has had. So I'll turn it to Ms. Snyder. Would you like to comment at the moment? You don't have to. Okay, Mr. Addix.
Not it. Thank you very much for having this discussion, albeit very long-form discussion. I think it's worth having. Our organization and our industry is involved in 4 ZTAs around the state right now. There's a hearing in Frederick tonight for a ZTA which moves to address all of the issues that are at your table as well. Different strokes for different folks. The counties each do it in a very different way. The general theme that we support is that when a ZTA is put forth to allow or encourage an industry like this to develop, that you're setting the 4 corners to aim them in the right direction, to aim them toward agriculture, to aim them toward using local ag. Wineries and breweries and distilleries are very different animals. Wineries, there is and you've heard from wineries, so I won't repeat their testimony, but just in summary, the best grapes come from, in our industry's experience, wineries who control them. And so wineries take very, very deep care to make sure that they are either growing themselves or managing very closely the grapes that they're purchasing or using or making into wine. With beer and with spirits, much of the crop that you're relying upon is a commodity crop. Hops are a specialty crop. Hops are a little closer on the spectrum to wine. But when you get to the basic ingredients of beer, to encourage them to use local for a farm brewery is spot on. To tell them they have to grow it in a meaningful way, where we've got folks here, experts, who can tell you what the translation is from acres into actual pints. But to have meaningful acreage, if you're trying to tell someone you're going to be a farm brewery, you better grow it. Well, we're talking in the 200 to 500 acre realm. That doesn't make sense.
To support a brewery. To
support a farm brewery because of the amount of grain that goes into the amount of malt that goes into the amount of beer. So what other counties have done is they don't get into the weeds on that. And they also don't get into the weeds on number of people. They use language like normal and customary. And you've gone further than that, and I think the industry has gone along with you in a lot of that, with the understanding that every jurisdiction has different concerns, and there is concern about number of cars and noise and all those things which are appropriate. But when it comes down to telling a brewery that wants to be a farm brewery, that not only you need to be a farm brewery and use local ingredients, but you have to grow X acres, and someone from an agency is going to make sure you can have X number of events and keep a log, and someone's going to make sure. You're getting into a level of regulation that's regulating the business and not allowing the opportunity. And so that I just caution you that I'll be testifying at some other ZTAs in the next week, where it's about the broader scope and trying to encourage the industry to not be event centers, because that's not what we're hearing in our industry anymore. People want to actually grow small businesses on farms that are farm-based, with the acknowledgement that, and you've done this with up to now with the ingredient requirements for beer and especially for wine, it's not possible in Maryland. It may be possible in Wisconsin, where the average farm brewery is on 1,000 acres. That may be possible. But that's not possible in New York, where they have a very strict requirement of how much to use, which is not a requirement of how much to grow. It's how much to use. And because you're putting that requirement on, it does artificially keep these businesses small. Look at Sugarloaf Vineyard, which is under the state's rules, where they have to use 50% Maryland fruit. They grow just about everything that they make into wine. And that's as big as, they may get a little bit bigger with the acreage that they have, and they may ask other people to grow grapes, but they're not going to be huge. They don't have interest in becoming an event facility. And you see that with our new small farm breweries as well. So I ask for your support of the language that has been in, and certainly the amendments that the council president has put forth.
Thank you, Mr. Addix.
Can I follow up with that? I don't understand from either of you why saying that a 5 acre minimum, if it's feasible, is intrusive. It's not saying you have to grow it if it's not feasible. It's not suggesting that you, God forbid, do 50% of your product has to come from your farm. I mean, we're not getting into any of that detail. We're just saying 5 acres, and if a farm is a minimum of 25, and we do have farms that are much larger than that, why it's unreasonable to try to say at least 5 acres at some point. You got a 5 acre minimum on wine, but you can make wine with less than 5 acres, but the state's seen fit to say you have to have a minimum amount of acreage. Why 1 acre doesn't seem like very much.
May I, Mr. Elrich? It seemed to me that the opportunity here is to move the entire ag reserve to supporting local ingredients, so that even farms that aren't breweries are growing barley or wheat. That's an opportunity that we have, and given that one farm brewery can use as much as 200 to 500 acres of farmland for its ingredients, the focus on a general plan to move the county towards local ingredients as a whole is the more significant, meaningful opportunity, as opposed to the additional 3 acres, 4 acres, that you're seeking to say that particular farmer should grow. The opportunity is hundreds of acres per brewery if we do a good job pulling together the industry and the farmers and saying, let's all grow some products. We need a malt house, for them to sell their grain to. We don't have such a malt house yet. But we should fund such a thing, or partner with, if necessary, with the private sector to do such a thing, I should say. But this can support local agriculture if we engage in that. But we need some breweries to open doors in order to create that market environment. And so the more barriers we put in front of the breweries to open doors, the less opportunity we're going to have to support local production. So
that's why I didn't make it a requirement. I said if they determine it can't be done, then you don't do it. If I'd said 5 acres and no less, then it's a barrier. And I understand that you might be hard put to grow 5 acres of hops, particularly since apparently only hops you can grow around here right now is garlic hops. Somebody made that comment to me. That was what grew here normally. That might not be really good in beer.
Yeah, we actually have some great research. There was a hop market last week where the University of Maryland showcased 25 different hop varieties, and yes, there was one that when you smell it, it smells like garlic, and that will not be in further trials. We did not have brewers lining up to make beer out of that one, but there were lots of other varieties. But just to answer your question, I think the concern for me as a small business owner of my own is when a regulatory entity has the ability to judge what in my business is or is not feasible. Feasible is a loaded term, which adds a level of and I understand your intent, but when you're saying, here's where you need to be, if it's feasible, that's concerning to a new business owner when Frederick does not ask you if your agricultural capabilities are feasible or not. Carroll County does not, Howard County does not, Loudoun County, my goodness, does not. So it's phrases like that. I think the intention is clearly, and your language, I'll be frank with you and say that the ZTA as was drafted coming into this session is one of the more restrictive in the state. That said, there are lots of parts of it that are reasonable, and as I mentioned before, every jurisdiction comes from a different place. Prince George's County is working through it as well. They're not talking about agriculture other than just acreage of land. So every jurisdiction has a different way of doing it. Yours is going to be on the more restrictive side, but you've engaged the community and you've engaged the agricultural community in the discussions, and I think you're at a place that feels like compromise.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Ulrich. All right. Mr. Leventhal.
So there is not a motion before us. Okay, that's helpful. I've been in dialogue with constituents on this. I know a lot of us have too. It is important to remember what's already in the ZTA as introduced. It has to be an accessory to a farm. So we are now, by definition, in the business of telling farmers what they may and may not do and what they may and may not sell. And so we've made some compromises. Agriculture, we don't draw a wall around other forms of Montgomery County agriculture. You can import chicks and grow them into hens on your farm. You can have a farm store, like Wade Butler has, and you can sell all kinds of things in your farm store. They don't have to be Montgomery County agricultural products, and that happens now. You can import seed, you can import feed, you can import fertilizer. Not all of these things have to originate in Montgomery County for raising livestock or crops. Also important to understand that under the ZTA as introduced, the land must be classified as agricultural and must qualify for a Maryland Class 8 farm brewery license, which limits production to no more than 15,000 barrels of beer per year. Now, to everybody except Judge Kavanaugh, 15,000 barrels sounds like a lot.
You were waiting to get that in.
Wow. But in fact,
I like that.
there's a legal definition of a regional craft brewery, which sounds like a small operation. A regional craft brewery may produce as much as 6 million barrels per year. So under the terms as introduced here, even before the Council President's further amendments, which I support, this is a small-scale, farm-based operation. And the more we get into micromanaging what this farm-based activity has to look like and how much local content, we're getting further and further away from any kind of prohibitions that we don't place any similar prohibitions on other agricultural activities. So it gets to your basic question of, is brewing beer an agricultural activity? Because the beer has to be brewed on site. Just like, you can import chickens, but the eggs are laid on site. I mean, if you can draw all kinds of parallels between other agricultural activities, which do involve importation of product. Also, it's important to remember that these farms are going to be on well. They're not going to be on public water. And that will limit production. So the fear that I've had expressed, and I know my colleagues have too, that we're opening the door to a massive industrial operation, that Anheuser-Busch is going to take over the ag reserve, that all of these things are going to occur. There's lots and lots of limits and prohibitions that give me comfort that that's not happening, that this is a small-scale agricultural related activity, and that's built into what we're considering here.
Mr. Katz.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. As you know, and as I mentioned last time, I sincerely believe we should wait for the planning board study. I think that's the right way to do this. Having said that, if we're not going to wait, which it looks like we're not, then I believe we have to be very, very concerned about keeping a business in business, to what has been said a couple times. If we're going to tell somebody how they have to do their production, and I know the people in the farming community can figure out the yield of a crop on an acre and everything else. I don't know how much they are actually going to be able to yield from that acre and how much business they can do from that acre and how everything fits together. But I am concerned in general, whether it be an acre or anything else, or for events, we are dealing with arbitrary numbers. And I think we need to make certain that if we're going to have this, then we should have this. I mean, even if we wait till for the study, I think everybody's in agreement that this is something that we would want in Montgomery County. That if we're going to have this, that we should have the industry make certain that the numbers that we're coming up with are reasonable to them, because for them to invest their money, they're going to have enough of whatever we're suggesting that they can make a return on it. And that's my concern, and whether 100 people at an event is the right number or 102 people at the event are the right number. We need to make certain, as far as I'm concerned, that what we're suggesting, whether it be from the yield with the minimum acre of the size of a farm to whatever else we're doing, that it actually works for the business. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Katz. So I think we will accept we'll move on. We've already accepted that amendment without objection. Is that okay? All right, final amendment that we didn't discuss previously is to address the minimum lot size or acre size, and give this one a lot of thought, and have recommended that we make a minimum 25-acre site size for a brewery or a distillery. This is not what many other communities are doing, but many other communities have not, don't have our agricultural reserves framework. So 25 acres is the minimum size of a residential parcel that you can create.
Residential parcel.
Point of clarification.
Yeah.
Site size?
Yes.
Are you saying lot? Are you saying parcel? Are you saying collection of properties?
Either lot or parcel, because you don't know how it comes in the ag reserve. So it would allow a parcel to come in at this size.
You wouldn't make them go through subdivision or anything like that?
I don't think we want
that's a different train that you'll go down short.
We have a 100-acre site. We're not saying you have to divide it to 25 acres. Is that what you mean?
No, you don't have to.
Whatever, you use the term site. That's not a term that's employed in the ordinance.
It has been employed in other situations.
Wrong again.
And again, it's to allow that flexibility. If you choose to allow a building permit to be issued on a parcel that's not subdivided, you wouldn't have to change this code.
This is only for the AR zone.
This is only for the AR zone, and it would really affect when a building permit is required to do this.
Okay, Mr. Rice has moved, and Mr. Berliner whispered in my ear moments before that he had seconded it. He advanced seconded it.
If I may, just to note, this does not apply to wineries. Currently, wineries has at least a minimum size of 5 acres because 5 acres has to be grown on site. This does not require 5 acres grown on site for wineries.
Would this grandfather any existing breweries?
I don't know that any existing breweries would be in violation of this. Jeremy, do you know?
No.
There is one.
There is one.
Farm brewery that is under construction. It's not open yet. The name is Elder Pine Brewing and Blending. It's in the AR zone. It's 16.7 acres. It is agriculturally assessed. And so that's the one that I am aware of.
Okay, well, we clearly don't want to make it
All
non-conforming.
right, so I'll move a grandfathering amendment for any brewery that had applied
about any
to do
previous-
business prior to the enactment of this.
They've applied for a permit?
The building was constructed as an agricultural building. They have a license from the comptroller's office. They have all the infrastructure in
Okay.
place.
All right, so it's for
Whatever language,
existing
that,
buildings.
any entity that had received its license from the controller before the enactment of this ordinance,
Right.
something like that.
There's only one.
There's only one that I'm aware of that has been in the AR zone. Now, we have people in the audience that are actually waiting to see what the council does on this with other operations, but that's the only one that I'm actually aware of.
All right, without objection. So those are the additional amendments. Mr. Zients, does that cover all of the amendments that I have recommended to my
Yes,
colleagues?
the only other thing that you didn't go through is for the activities that are ordinary and customary. You would amend the number of ticketed events or cover charge events to 5. You could have as many, well, if you're stomping grapes, if you can have that without number, but if you're having a special kind of ticketed or cover charge event, it's limited to 5. This sort of parallels what exists in the winery situations where it's currently limited to 5 ticketed or covered events, but allows the normal and customary kind of event without limit.
Okay, it's been moved.
Second.
Seconded. Mr. Leventhal seconded, Mr. Rice moved. Rule without objection. All right. Now, I will turn it to colleagues who may wish to offer any additional amendments. Mr. Berliner.
Very briefly, colleagues, what we don't have in the moment is a setback requirement, which we have throughout the Ag Reserve for equestrian facilities. It's 100 feet. So I have an amendment that basically says any building or surface parking area used for farm alcohol production and related events must be located at least 100 feet from an existing lot line. All existing structures for this allowed use are grandfathered.
And may I just suggestion to save some words? You could just say any new building or new surface parking lot instead of having the grandfathering.
I'll accept that.
We do this without objection.
Okay.
Oh, there's no objection.
It's got to be moved and,
So I'll second it.
okay.
I've moved it.
Moved and seconded to this item. Ms. Florine.
Well, I ask, what is the problem that this is solving? I don't know. I mean, there are, if we're talking about the ag zones, properties tend to be, well, I'm not even sure if we can generalize where activity centers are because they're large properties typically. But I don't think you want to encourage impervious surfaces where you don't have to. There may be an entrance road closer to the front that serves the needs of the operation. Why would you say it has to be 100 feet away? Is it to protect the neighbors? I don't see this as an issue particularly. Are you alluding to parking on grassy areas? I mean, we've all been out to Sugarloaf. I don't know if that's a parking lot or not when you park in the field. Is that a problem? I don't think so. I'm just not sure what the issue is that's being solved. We're not talking about communities where there is a lot of intensive activity. We're not talking about neighbor-to-neighbor issues really out in the agricultural zones. I would guess that most things would satisfy this objective under any circumstance, but I'm not sure what this particular unique rule, what problem this particular unique rule addresses. I don't know. Jeremy, can you speak to that? Do you have any observations on this subject? I just think more rules just makes it harder.
I would agree that more rules make it harder and that we're good at developing rules.
We grow them pretty regularly down here.
However, I have a question because I thought that the equestrian section of the zoning code stated that the setback was from a occupied dwelling on an adjacent lot as compared to the adjacent.
It's the reverse. The setback in the now I got to remember which one I was doing. Which are the two that we're talking about? The setback for a winery is from a property line. The accessory in the equestrian events is from a dwelling.
Yes, that's correct. So Councilmember Berliner suggested that the setback should be from the lot line, and I believe...
No, it's the dwelling.
Oh, that's not what it says.
No, actually, I had proposed abutting property, and Mr. Zion suggested lot line, so...
But I thought the language says, right here, an existing dwelling on an abutting property.
And I think...
No,
Okay, well, this is a good
so
thing, conversation to have.
I apologize, colleagues. There was an earlier version of it that did, in fact, say abutting property, and at the suggestion of Mr. Zion's, I amended it to say, as he had recommended, any existing lot line.
But what Mr. Chris is alluding to, an existing structure.
Correct. An existing dwelling on an
abutting
adjacent lot.
property is the same as a lot line. I mean, that's just another way of saying the same thing. That's different from an existing structure. If it's an existing structure, I have no problem with that change. And if that's what you're intending, I'll stop speaking. But if it's an existing lot line, it's a far more academic issue.
Mr. Zions, do you want to speak to why you had recommended the change?
Can I just say, this one, what I have in front of me is saying an existing dwelling on an abutting property, which is very necessary because if it's on the farm, the person that's doing this property, if their house is there and they want to have this use there, they should have it. So it's not just an existing dwelling, it's on the existing dwelling.
We all appear to have a different version of this, Mr.
Again,
Katz,
I do apologize to my colleagues. There's one version that says from an existing dwelling on an abutting property. There's one version that says an existing dwelling on an abutting property.
That's Mr. Katz's version.
Right.
And then, at the suggestion of staff,
I know.
that was modified, so it must be located at least 100 feet from an existing lot line. And so I am, in good faith, seeking to understand from Mr. Zions why he had recommended that change. And if you want to give voices to whether or not you feel like going back to the original 100 feet from an existing dwelling on an abutting property is okay.
Again, I was modeling the setback from the language in wineries that dealt with the setback from a property line under certain conditions. It is true, and I knew at the time that equestrians had a different provision that said from a dwelling on an abutting property. Certainly, the setback from a property line gives more protection to neighbors. It is a more conservative approach to neighbors. If you allow it, if you do it from dwellings on abutting properties, all of the setback might be on the abutting property owner's ground, so that it could be if that house is set back 200 feet from the property line, there is no setback. If it's set back 50 feet, it's a 50-foot setback. So rather than having it dependent on the neighbor, I suggested doing it by property line.
Mr. Berliner, I very much like your first approach.
Which was what?
Which was what you had, Mr. Council. So I would certainly...
Let's go with the first approach.
I think that was a brilliant choice on your part, and I support it. So I'll move that. I'll second your motion on that.
Once again, friendly.
This is like somebody's playing the lottery and plays every number.
Right, you're going to win.
All right, so the first version. Okay, without objection?
Without objection.
Go ahead.
Mr. President, so I just want to, since the motion, I just want to restate it for folks because there was still a change that was made in terms of new and striking the existing structure. So I just want to read for my colleagues and for audience that are following along just to make sure that it's very clean. So it would say, any new building or surface parking area used for farm alcohol production and related events must be located at least 100 feet from any existing dwelling on an abutting property, period. The grandfather's in because it's new. It's new, right? Okay? All right. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Rice.
Thank you, colleagues.
Any other items for our consideration? All right, Mr. Berliner.
So I wanted to share the conversation that Mr. Elrich and I had, in which I had with staff and my own staff, with respect to language that Mr. Zions concluded is not appropriate for a ZTA, but would be a freestanding resolution, which basically says we're doing something new here, and that every 2 years we ought to get a report from the Department of Agriculture as to how we're doing, what the impact is on communities, what the impact is, how we're doing in terms of growing more locally sourced materials, how many permits have been granted. And so at the suggestion of Mr. Zions, I wanted to share with my colleagues that I would be introducing that as a freestanding either resolution or bill and circulate language and make sure that we're doing something very important here, obviously, and something that has many people very nervous as well as excited. And it's something that, just as a matter of course, I feel like we ought to be keeping tabs on, not in an overly intrusive way, not every year, but every 2 years, get a report that basically tells us how we're doing. So that was the conversation that Mr. Elrich and I had that allowed him to feel a little more comfortable with the number of events, because we'll get a feedback as to, is this okay, or do we have to make do you, the future council, have to make mid-course corrections? And so it's just a tool by which you can judge how we're doing. So that's what I'll offer as a resolution or legislation, pass it around, and whoever cares to join, be delighted.
Thank you, Mr. Berliner. We'll take that up in the future. And I think that concludes our legislative work. We need to vote. By work, I guess I don't count voting as working. It's just... But before we go to a vote, I just want to thank everyone for working so hard on this. I really appreciate all of my colleagues' participation and efforts. Again, Mr. Rice, your leadership as co-lead, and the industry and the advocates. We worked very closely together, and we chopped our way through amendment proposal after amendment proposal to try to find that right balance. I hope that we've found that right balance, and I hope that everyone feels that we've had a responsive process, even if they don't necessarily believe that every provision of this is precisely what they wanted, that this was a responsive legislative process. And I want to really thank my colleagues and just acknowledge all or salute all the work that we've done together over the last several years to promote the local production of beer and wine and spirits in Montgomery County. This is, I think, maybe the final major provision that is needed at this moment. We've already addressed zoning and rules affecting these types of businesses in our urban areas, in our commercial areas. We now have them thriving in our urban districts and in our industrial areas. We've created economic development incentives. We've waived water sewer hookup fees. We've tried our best to open the door and create an on-ramp for the businesses to thrive in this county, and we're seeing the results. We already have several ag farm breweries. We have some incredible wineries coming into the county. We are really, it's just, there's a lot happening in this area, and I think a huge amount of it is because the county council is continuing to express its strong desire, and the community is embracing the industry. And I think that's what the entrepreneurs ultimately look for, is a community that it wants them, and so where they feel that they can take a risk and hopefully succeed. So this is again, I think another major piece of this agenda that we have really worked on and succeeded with together. Mr. Rice.
Mr. President, I just wanted to thank you for your leadership on this bill, and thank your office. Tommy has been working day and night to really try and work with all the folks, and you guys have done a great job in creating a collaboration. I just want to state what this means, because I think that, again, as you heard from the council president, this is about providing options to reduce the pressure that we'll continue to have on our agricultural reserve to develop. Let's just be very clear about that. The more that we can do to support the flexibility that we give to our farmers means the more viable the agricultural reserve is, it means less pressure we have on it for development. If you care about the ag reserve, you want to free up and give the ability for our farmers to do different kinds of things. And the spin-offs from this are our commodities farmers may start growing barley, may start growing hops as a portion of what it is that they do now. This has so many ancillary effects beyond just the breweries themselves and those particulars. And you may have folks who say, you know what, I'm just going to start a barley farm or a hops farm. There are so many potentials that are out there. It's great. But one of the things we didn't talk about that as chair of the Education Committee, I have to make sure that I bring up just in closing is about our kids and our future generations and their tie-in to agriculture. We've diversified so many things in our school system, from MCPS all the way up through our colleges, in making sure that we offer an array of opportunities for people in terms of what they're going to major in. Today, what we're doing is we're saying, when it comes to viticulture, when it comes to really figuring out for breweries and all of the things, what our kids can do and how they can get experience and see firsthand about potential business opportunities that are out there for them. And so this is a tremendous plus for us on so many levels, not just for making beer, which a lot of people like and is great, but there's so many other things that go into this that, again, I want to make sure that people understand, that support our overall mission of what we are as Montgomery County. And that truly is a diverse delivery of all kinds of things to a myriad of residents. And so I'm just really proud to see that we're having something like this that continues in the spirit of what our agricultural reserve, I feel, was meant to be.
Thank you to the council member from what might be one day wine country. Mr. Leventhal.
As my colleagues know, I'm an enthusiastic supporter of this ZTA. I do think it is important to understand that we're not embarking on something that's all that new, because we have wineries and we have breweries in the Ag Reserve now. What this ZTA does is it provides clarity to those who are already in business as to what they may and may not do under what terms, and to those who may seek to enter the business. Unfortunately, what it also does is it shuts down an opportunity that would be available prior in the RE1 zone, because now we're clarifying that this activity may take place in the AR zone. And I'd like to understand, and I'm not offering an amendment at this time, but we have interest, and Mr. Chris referred to this. Why does this ZTA restrict an activity that would have been allowed in the RE1 zone before the enactment of this ZTA?
This ZTA takes interpretations from DPS and codifies them. And that was what was attempted to be done. In the course of doing that, it modeled its range for where the use is allowed on where wineries are allowed, so it was not allowed in the RE1 zone. This would, in fact, its adoptions would, in fact, override the interpretations of the department, and it would not be allowed in the RE1 zone as it's drafted.
Okay. So, well, again, I appreciate the good intent of all my colleagues. I don't think we're embarking on anything particularly new. I hope that some limited new businesses will open. We've heard from a number which plan to open. I think they're following the market. I don't want to overstate the effect that the county council has. If something's profitable, investors will move in that direction. I understand, and we discussed this through staff, that if we were to address the RE1 zone with all of the anxiety and panic and exaggeration, frankly, and which I addressed earlier, about what the impact of this would be in the agricultural reserve, had we expanded it to a residential zone, a rural residential zone, it's likely we would have had to combat even more anxiety and misinformation. And I don't want to repeat the remarks I made earlier, but given the relatively low density of brewery operations in our urban zones today, I think the risk is de minimis that there will be a brewery on every corner, and that hordes of drunk people will be populating the ag reserve forever and ever, and it'll crowd out all the other virtuous activities in the ag reserve. I don't think that will happen. I don't think the market will dictate that. I don't think the investment capital would be there. I don't think there's enough consumer interest in it, because there isn't that much consumer interest in the city of Rockville. We have just a couple of breweries, and in Silver Spring, heavily dense and populated, and in Bethesda, there's just a few breweries. So the likelihood that there will be lots and lots in the ag reserve, I think, is minimal. And perhaps after some time passes and we see that it has not drastically changed the nature of the ag reserve, except that a few investors are making profits, which is what we want in the ag reserve, so that they can keep farmland viable. Perhaps in the future the council will return to this issue in other zones, acknowledging that there is a lot of consumer demand for this activity right now, and that and I also want to commend Council President Reamer, because he's been out in front on this for a long time, that we're probably going to have to continue to modify and adapt, assuming that this continues to be a popular trend. It may be that consumer tastes will change, and they won't be so interested in unique and interesting locally brewed beers, and they'll go back to drinking imported beers or large commercial beers. We just don't know. Right now, this is something that is a profitable activity, and I think it's exciting to see more of it taking place, because I personally enjoy it. But and I think the county benefits from it. But I think the RE1 discussion is one that I would hope a future council might take up again in relatively reasonably short order. Once we ascertain, which I think we will, that this has not, and I'm quoting from some of the emails that I've got, destroyed the agricultural reserve. I absolutely do not think it will do that.
Thank you, Mr. Leventhal. Yes, Mr. Rice and I were discussing that, and that seems like a natural way to proceed, is to consider an amendment just focused on this specific zone. But we also felt like, to bring in the uncertainty of a new zone at this late stage in the process would just create an unpredictability here. So it makes sense to just consider it discreetly, and we can consider whether we'll do that. I think your comments are on point there. Mr. Elrich.
I think this has been an interesting effort, and I think it comes out balancing things in an important way. I don't think that breweries will pop up everywhere. I mean, the issue of water alone is going to be a constraint, and I will say that somebody does have to monitor water tables. I mean, these are things we're going to have to think about if you push more activities into these areas that could consume lots of water. We have to be aware of what our water tables are going to be like, and there's a lot of concern in the whole Potomac region about what the availability of water is going to be under the circumstances of climate change. So I don't think this is not an issue that doesn't require some ongoing monitoring. On the other hand, the greatest threat to the ag reserve has always been whether people find farming profitable or not. And nationally, and I don't know the statistics for the ag reserve, but most farmers use supplemental income to support themselves. Other than the large agribusinesses, most independent farmers don't make enough money off of farming in and of itself, and so they're often engaged in supplementary economic activities. And so it's important to recognize that having supplementary economic activities in the ag reserve is not atypical of what farmers have to deal with all across the country, not just here. My hope is, you would never think about turning a Sonoma or any of these other places into vast housing tracts because the value of the land as agriculture has reached the point where you're not going there. And my hope is that as people find other profitable uses, particularly wine, which grapes leave the farm gate at number 6 value crop. If you put them in a bottle, they leave at the number 2 value crop. That we can incentivize something that actually makes the efforts or concerns about the long-term viability of the ag reserve greatly reduces the threat of people saying turn this into housing because they can make a decent living out of it through agricultural activities. So I think this enhances the viability of the reserve for the purposes that we created the reserve. And I just think it's a matter of trying to strike a balance that you don't make something unpleasant that should actually be pleasant. So we'll continue to monitor. I look forward to Roger's introduction of some monitoring language, and I think at the end of the day we can get this balance right.
Thank you, Mr. Elrich. Ms. Florine.
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to continue that observation. This is all about making agriculture sustainable. This is all about supporting our farming community. This is clearly a statement of our commitment to seeing breweries, cideries, wineries as clearly accessory uses to the overall objective of the ag reserve. This is all about keeping our families in place in agricultural environments, and this is all about protecting that green space. And I want to thank all the players who have contributed to this conversation. I know it's difficult. It was good to hear from you, sir. I forget your name. Mr. Addix, because that was a very helpful, practical view, and I think it's worth considering why we couldn't be a little bit more like our neighbors in creating a more flexible environment for these kinds of operations. But at the end of the day, I think these terms reflect Montgomery County values and Montgomery County objectives. So I want to thank everybody for their hard work, and I reiterate our commitment here to preserving agricultural activities in the long run, and this will be a help to that.
Thank you, Ms. Florine. I think it is time for a vote. So
Mr.
this
Elrich?
is a roll call vote. Yes.
Yes.
Mr. Ulrich votes yes. Mr. Hucker?
Yes.
Mr. Hucker votes yes. Mr. Rice?
Yes.
Mr. Rice votes yes. Mr. Berliner?
Yes.
Mr. Berliner votes yes. Mr. Leventhal?
Yes.
Mr. Leventhal votes yes. Ms. Florine?
Yes.
Ms. Florine votes yes. Mr. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Katz votes yes. Ms. Navarro?
Yes.
Ms. Navarro votes yes. Mr. Reamer?
Yes. And that is unanimous. Thank you. All right. We will take recess until our 1:30. We're going to begin. Oh, we need 6. We need another council member. Mr. Rice is in the room. All right. Oh, we're good. All right. This is a public hearing on an amendment to the FY 19-24 Capital Improvements Program for the Goldsboro Road Sidewalk and Bikeway. Action is tentatively scheduled immediately following the hearing. I think we have no speakers for this hearing. Mr. Orland, can you please share some background?
Sure. This is an amendment to basically clear up my mess. The T&E committee approved this project in a work session on, what date was that? In April 18th, 2018, and the full council approved it unanimously in work session on May 14th, and it did not get changed during CIP reconciliation. But OMB and yours truly somehow forgot to include this project in the resolution. And so there is no project. So the only way to actually put this in the CIP, which is what you wanted to have happen, is to amend the CIP. And so it's the same project you saw in the spring, same dollars. The impact, it's a $21 million project, but only about 11% of it, about $2.4 million, is in the 6-year period, and all that's in the last 3 years where there's plenty of capital reserve. So it really won't impact anything on the CIP side in terms of what can be spent on other things. So I recommend approval.
Okay, so we need a motion, and it's been moved by Mr. Rice, seconded by Mr. Katz, and this is a show of hands to add this item back to the capital improvements program where we thought it was all along. All those in favor, show your hands, and that is unanimous among those present. Thank you. Next item. This is a public hearing on a special appropriation to the county government's FY19 operating budget for the Department of Health and Human Services in the amount of $70,799 for behavioral health and crisis services for the Adult Drug Court Program. An HHS Public Safety Committee work session is tentatively scheduled for Monday, October 15th, 2018. Persons wishing to submit additional comments or material for consideration should do so before the close of business on October 10th. And we have a number of speakers, beginning with our distinguished Judge Nelson Rupp and former council member Phil Andrews and Lynn Boynton, Rodney Sims, Nicholas Borowski, and is it Bunny Boswell or Bonnie Bunny? Thank you. So you'll speak in that order, and as you know, we have 3 minutes for each speaker, and when 30 seconds are remaining, the yellow light will come on. Judge Rupp, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, President Ryan.
You'll need to hit the button at the base of the microphone bar and then move that. The light comes on, sorry, it's at the base of this proboscis-looking. It's good to have a council member with you at the dais, former council member. And then bring it close.
There you go. I need somebody to help me tie my shoes.
That's okay. Your judgment is sound.
All right. All right. We ready? Thank you for asking me to be here and support the request of Councilmember Katz and Councilmember Florine to appropriate $70,799 to the Department of Health and Human Services to fund an additional therapist for the adult drug court. 14 years ago, we began our adult drug court with the assistance of a number of disparate agencies, including the State's Attorney's Office, Public Defender's Office, Health and Human Services, Department of Parole and Probation, Sheriff's Office, and Court Administration. We have continued to work together over the past 14 years with tremendous results. The Montgomery County Council, you have been an essential component to our success. Your funding of the Health and Human Services aspect of drug court is critical to our ability to successfully address the needs of our drug court participants. Our drug court population consists of nonviolent addicted offenders. We have made a conscious decision to focus our efforts on repeat offenders. The first offender or second offender may not need the intense treatment, monitoring, and supervision that drug court provides. Drug court is a difficult program. It takes on average 3 years to complete it. Each participant is required to attend treatment sessions 3 times per week, undergo random urinalysis 2 to 3 times per week, have weekly contact with a case manager, come to court weekly, attend 3 12-step meetings per week, have employment, and live in approved sober housing. The vast majority of our drug court population has never succeeded at anything. The vast majority of our drug court population has lived a life of addiction and crime. The vast majority of our drug court population enters drug court to avoid a lengthy period of incarceration. Consequently, changing a lifetime of behavior and conduct for this population is an incredible challenge, but it is also incredibly rewarding to see these individuals get their lives back, their families back, and to have hope for a better way of life makes all the time, effort, and stress worthwhile. The people who work in our drug court are here on a mission to our community. It is a ministry. It is not a job. It is our passion. We have experienced the joy of 102 successful graduates from drug court. But we are failing. We cannot continue to work with our drug court participants without your help. Yikes. The staffing of one therapist for every 20 participants is woefully inadequate because our drug court population has drastically changed over the past 14 years. 2004, the primary substance of abuse were alcohol, marijuana, PCP, and cocaine. Opioid abuse was non-existent. Now, 2/3 of our population reports opioid abuse. Synthetic substances such as K2 and others that mimic opioids are significant issues.
Judge, I don't make the rules, I just enforce them.
We need your support. Thank you.
All right.
He was hoping that would happen.
I didn't want it to happen, actually, but I wasn't quite sure how I could. Exactly. Thank you for giving us the chance to support your work, Judge. We really appreciate it. We will refer to your written remarks, and you've got a terrific panel of other speakers here to help bring it. Thank you, Judge Rupp. Mr. Andrews.
Thank you. Thank you, Council President Reamer and members of the Council. I'm representing John McCarthy, our state's attorney here today, who wishes he could be here because he is a no bigger fan of this program than in fact, I don't think any other bigger fan could be found other than a few other people in this room who have worked on drug court for years. This is one of the best programs that Montgomery County finances. It is probably the best drug court in the nation. And that's because of the people that you see to my left and some of the people in the back as well who work this program every day. For 14 years, Montgomery County has had a drug court. More than 200 people have graduated from drug court. As Judge Roop said, if these folks were not in drug court, they would be in jail or likely dead. These lives have been turned around by this amazing program, and it is the therapists that do perhaps the most intensive work along with the case managers with these individuals. Judge Roop is the champion judge that made this happen. That's how, as you know, problem-solving courts get started. That's how the mental health court has been launched, and the support of all of you for these problem-solving courts is been unstinting, because I think you understand that this is the smart approach to criminal justice, that these are folks that should not be in jail, and if we can do, they did something to be in jail, but they should not stay there if we can help them make better decisions about how to live their lives by overcoming their addiction or their mental illness. And so Mr. McCarthy enthusiastically and very strongly supports this appropriation. If by chance the County Council has recently acquired the authority to override the mandatory retirement age for judges, he would like you to amend this appropriation to do so, because unfortunately Judge Roop's retirement is approaching sometime next spring. So, but short of that, he urges you to give expeditious and speedy approval to this appropriation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman, former Councilman Andrew. Lynn Boynton.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to all of you. I provided a fact sheet for the Montgomery County Adult Drug Court Program that shows you the intensity of the supervision of the participants, which is one of the many reasons why we need an additional therapist. It's very, very big job, and we have an increasing number of participants, as you all know, based on the current drug crisis. I had been involved as past president of the bar following going to 6 funerals in 6 months for people who died of opioid overdoses in 2014 and 15, and have learned a lot, and I'm still learning a lot. But the one entity that seems to be getting the most done for the least money in the shortest amount of time is the drug court. And I believe it's because they have created the perfect balance of tough love, consistency, insisting on long-term treatment, with instant consequences for failure to comply, so that they're keeping people alive long enough, that they're clean long enough, that their brains get rewired, and they might have a chance at recovering, going back to their families, taking care of their families, and no longer being a drain on our social service system. So it's not just money for drug court. It's going to relieve many other elements of our system if we can try to curb this crisis by letting drug court do what it does so well. They only have a 20% recidivism rate, which there's no rehab program ever that could have those kind of statistics. And I think it speaks for itself, but a 32-month program is long enough for someone's brain to get rewired and they have a chance of recovering. And if we can do everything we can to support them and give them as much permanent funding as possible, it will come back exponentially. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Boynton. It's so nice to get a chance to learn about this program through this testimony today. Appreciate your participation. Rodney Sims. Okay. Nicholas Borowski.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nicholas Borowski. I have lived here in Montgomery County my entire life. I'd like to briefly share my story with you and explain how the adult drug court program helped save my life. Let me repeat. The Montgomery County Adult Drug Program saved my life. I started using substances to escape my emotions and responsibilities at a young age. Drugs gave me the relief. Once I started using, it was already too late. I developed a 2-gram-a-day heroin habit. Due to my using, we'd been raided by the Secret Service. Montgomery Drug Task Force was working with my own mother. I could not get out of bed. I would go in and out of Montgomery General Hospital due to abscesses, cellulitis, and staph infections. Even the FBI came to my landlord's house looking for me to ask questions, but luckily I was in Avery Road. My family expected my death, heck, even expected it, and I even welcomed it. By the time of my eventual arrest, I didn't want to live. I felt like I had failed life in every aspect. The drugs, no matter how much I had in my pocket, did not fill the empty shell of a person I was. I was an addict in active addiction who thought that there was no way out. Jenna Davis, the drug court coordinator, saw my case on her radar and worked very hard behind the scenes in order to have my case be accepted into the drug court. Jenna and the state's attorney, Karen Mooney, thought I was the perfect and ideal candidate. At that point, I was facing multiple felonies and prison time. I listened to my gut and decided to take the adult drug court program, and it changed my life. Drug court and total abstinence forced me to take an honest look at myself. The main thing drug court instilled in me was patience. And patience is defined as the capacity to accept or tolerate delay, trouble, or suffering without getting angry or upset. And as a youth, I could never sit through feelings and sit through responsibilities without reacting negatively or acting out. Today, I'm a taxpayer, a sponsor, a father-in-law, a son, a brother, a fiance, a student, an intern at the Library of Congress, and I work at a new outpatient program in Montgomery County called Second Chance Addiction Care. All that stuff is good, and all but the most important thing in my life is that I'm a clean addict in recovery. That's the most important thing out of all the stuff I've earned. And I just recently celebrated 3 years clean. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for sharing your story, Nicholas. That's remarkable, and you really are on the path to success. Nice work. Ms. Boswell.
Good afternoon, everybody. Did the light come on? It's on. It's on? Bunny Boswell. Been around for the last 51 years. Been with drug court for the past 14 years. And I'm here today only to ask you guys for help. We need help. Our young people are dying, and they're dying rapidly. And $70,000, $170,000 is not enough to equate what the people that I work for and with do. They work hard. They're there at 9 o'clock at night and 7 o'clock in the morning to help the young people that are depressed, that are paranoid, that are afraid, that are lonely, that are hungry, that have no one there to really support them. And we are there. Drug court has been one of the best programs that I've had to deal with in my 51 years of being here. TASS was great, but this is greater. And this young fellow right here, he's something else. He's awesome. And he works with us. He works with the clients. And one of the things that we do most and foremost with these clients is we support them and we love them. We let them know that we care. Montgomery County, get off your butts and care. You know, give us the money to do what we need to do to help these folks, and come down to 971 Rollins Avenue and visit us. Look at what we do. Look at who we're working with. And we're not working with somebody that just went out and took a couple of pills overnight. We're working with kids that are killing themselves. I want to see these young people live. I want to see them have babies. I want to see them grow up. And drug court does not just stop because they have graduated. Some graduate and some don't. I'm getting calls for people that's been in drug court, didn't graduate, but it helped them turn their lives around. I had a call yesterday from a young lady who asked me to help get a young man into drug court. She didn't even graduate, but she's doing fine. And she said, thanks, because of drug court, she carried that information with her. It didn't happen then, but it did happen. So I'm not going to be long-winded. You all write the check. That's what we need, okay? We need the help. And it takes a little bit of money to take it a long way, okay? So I expect to see not 70,000, but how about 170? Maybe we need 2 more.
Thank you, Ms. Boswell. Thank you for saving lives. Thank you for your work in the community. Judge, is there anything you'd like to add, anything you didn't get a chance to say, or points you'd like to make?
Yeah, I just, I mean, these folks said it all, but Lynn, as president of the Montgomery County Bar Association 2015, made it her signature platform, the opioid addiction. Not the typical professionalism, civility, the things we hear. Over 1,000 lawyers there on the law day, induction of Lynn as president. And she has put her money where her mouth is. Involved in programs, with the schools, with the police, with the state's attorney. And so to listen to Lynn here today, she is somebody. And this guy here, he was 30 years old. He's got 3 years of sobriety, an opiate addict, and he has turned his life around. And Bunny Boswell, Saint Bunny, no. She was recognized by Ike Leggett for her 50 years of service to the community. You have a problem, you call Bunny. And she was my first drug court case manager. Wouldn't have started drug court without her. Back in 2004, you got to have a job. And we're typical court session during the day. And I said, how come Hassan Twyman doesn't have a job? He's a good-looking guy. I know he's trying to get a job. And she looks at me, she goes, who's going to hire him if he's got to come to court once a day every week? So we moved it to night court, just like that, because of Bunny. We're here to serve the community, and it is hard work. It's hard work, and we need your support. We need your help. We need an additional therapist. Thank you for considering.
Thank you, Judge Roop. We have a few lights on. Councilmember Katz.
And thank you. I'm not going to belabor the point, but I, too, want to just thank you all for what you do. I come to the graduations. I've seen you in action in many ways, and you do save lives. But I think the most important thing, and Lynn touched on this before, is the tough love. I've been in that room when somebody said, and I talk about it all the time, that somebody said that they were facing 110 years in jail, that they had been in and out of jail like this young man here. He had all these problems. Nothing ever got to him. But when it was Judge Quirk, I believe, that said that you're going to be facing 110 years in jail, he said to the judge, he said, Your Honor, you got my attention that day. And for some reason they would. And he changed his life. He absolutely went back to his family. His children were in the room. I mean, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. And that's what this is all about. The $70,000 is a number that we should and will, hopefully, be giving. But it's the amount of love that's given to these people that need love during times when they don't have it for themselves in some cases is the most important part. Thank you all for what you do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Katz. Mr. Rice.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. Borowski, I wanted to ask you, because your case is one that's very riveting to me, but it's indicative of what we continue to see amongst a lot of young people in our community. And so I'm curious, when did you start using? Were you in school when you first started using?
I was 15 years old.
Okay, and so were there ever folks within the school system that had identified and recognized some of the signs that you may be using and tried to reach out to you, or was that something that you just didn't experience?
Yeah, from the second I started using, there was consequences. The school, therapists, my parents tried to get me into therapy, but nothing worked. I mean, until I was ready, nothing worked.
Okay, it's one in which I chair the education committee, so it's one in which I just always want to make sure that we are trying to do what we can to reach out to folks. I think what Councilmember Katz was saying is that it's never the right time until it's the right time, and so you have to be able to decide that this is the time in which I'm going to make that change. I really want to applaud you for that, but certainly just wanted to understand a little bit more about your background and history and make sure that there weren't some missteps along the way. But thank you very much for your courage in being able to share your story with us and continuing to be an advocate and continuing to give back to others who face the same challenges that you faced.
Thank you so much.
Very good. Well, this appropriation will help us ensure that we can be there when a person is ready to begin their new life. So appreciate Mr. Katz bringing this forward. Thank you to all of you who came here to participate today and to help us better understand this issue. All right. Our next item, agenda item number 11, the FY20 Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission spending control limits. There's a T&E committee work session tentatively scheduled for October 11th, and this is a public hearing on that item. The process requires that the councils set annual ceilings on WSSC's new debt service, water and sewer operating expenses, and the maximum average rate increase. And anyone wishing to submit additional materials for our consideration should do so before the close of business on October 8th. And Mr. Brenny, is it Bren or Brenny? Brenny, you might need a program to recover from your WSSC testimonies, which we appreciate your willingness to continue to be a watchdog on this issue. And thank you. So you're up, Mr. Brenny.
Well, thank you, Hans. This marks the 20th anniversary of my involvement in WSSC cost control. Back in 1998, I teamed up with a number of other civic activists, and we created a program that actually brought costs under control for a few years. I'm here today representing the Taxpayers League, and I'd like to talk with you about the process that you all rely on to set rates. And I'm going to suggest some improvements, and those improvements we feel will avoid a taxpayer bailout, and it involves simply transferring the rate-making process to the PSC. Your process has failed repeatedly, and we offer the planned 6% rate increases over each of the next 4 years as Exhibit A. Our water rates are already among the highest in the area, double Fairfax's. It's no wonder we can't compete for economic development. WSSC's debt coverage ratio of 1 to, that's revenue over debt service costs, is perilously low, just half of Moody's median value of 2, which Fairfax Water maintains. An economic downturn will trigger a sudden spending reduction because WSSC only has 90 days of cash reserves, compared to 1 year for Fairfax Water. Worse, the staff projects debt service costs to balance this budget on an arbitrary low 3.8% interest rate for new debt. That's less than this year's 5% and ignores the Federal Reserve plans to increase rates. If that didn't put you to sleep, this will. Our out-of-control operating and capital spending is to blame for WSSC's high rates and weak financial condition. Why? WSSC is not governed by best practices, but rather by conflict avoidance between the two counties, each of whom have significant conflicts of interest of their own because of their role in selecting and advising management, and the commissioners. Also, the process is too rate-oriented. Growth doesn't pay for growth and is subsidized by ratepayers. System development charges and fees do not cover costs. New staff projections justify a 6% rate increase by balancing the budget with unspecified revenue transfers, credits, unspecified cost reductions for the first time in the history of this process. I'm going to jump to the bottom line. Rate reviews should be performed by the Public Service Commission, as they do for every other water utility in the state. This would allow the ridiculous default budget provision to be dropped. That's the one that says WSSC gets its proposed budget if the two counties don't agree on rates. The two counties would rely on the PSC to make a fair determination of reasonable rates based on objective criteria for operating costs and capital improvements, not the judgment of county staff, who have little water utility experience. WSSC would then be incentivized to implement stronger spending controls. That's about all I have. I'm certainly welcome to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bruni. You've put your finger on some important issues there, and you know, it has the process that we have is something that deserves to be asked. Why is it that way? And so it seems like something we ought to give some thought to. So, Mr. Elrich.
I'll just be quick. Do you have written down a deeper analysis of what their problems are and how they got there? Because just simply controlling their budget wouldn't solve any of the problems you eliminated, let alone the problem of breaking infrastructure that needs to be replaced. So I'd be interested if you could send some stuff, you know, our way.
Yeah, we testified on this about 4 weeks ago before the commission and provided a great deal of detail. Your point is, I think that there's a horrendous legacy cost to all of the capital spending that's gone on over the years. And it's accelerated within the last 10 years, pushing our capital reserve to about 40% of all spending. That's the debt service costs. That's a point where if you spend any more on major projects, you're not going to get your rating from the underwriting organizations, and your interest costs are going to go up. We're walking a tightrope. If the economy turns down, it's not just that bills aren't going to be paid because of that 90-day cash surplus. We're going to have to cancel a lot of projects. And I just don't see any contingency plans in the capital plan, the 5-year, 6-year, 10-year, to address that. And the amazing thing is, yeah, we have an old infrastructure, but I bring to your attention that we have a 16% water loss rate. That's unbilled or leaked water before it even reaches the revenue-paying customer. So that's water we process that we don't generate any revenue on. On the other side, on the sewage side, 40% of all sewage processed is from infiltration or inflows. Didn't come from somebody's toilet or washing machine. And that doesn't generate revenue either. So we have an extremely archaic infrastructure, and we're trying to hold it up with a very archaic process to determine what rates should be. We need an independent determination to keep this organization alive. Thank you for the question.
All right. Thank you very much. And our next item is a public hearing on amendments to the 10-year Comprehensive Water Supply and Sewer Systems Plans water and sewer category changes. Testimony will be heard on 6 requested changes. T&E committee work session is tentatively scheduled for Tuesday, October 23rd. And persons wishing to submit additional material for the council's consideration should do so before the close of business on October 18th. We have 3 speakers, Ted Smart, Siham Hanani, and Jim Clifford. So you'll come forward. So in the order of Ted Smart, Siham, and Jim. And you know the rules. You have 3 minutes. When you have 30 seconds remaining, that light will come on. At that point, you should really, the end should be in sight, or else you'll not likely be able to finish your testimony. So if you do get the red light, you can finish the sentence that you're in, but please don't begin a new one. Mr. Smart.
My name's Ted Smart. I live at 13200 Cleveland Drive, Rockville, Maryland. I'm the applicant along with my wife on our application. The executive and we support the executive and DEP's recommendation for approval. You guys have seen me before. This is a category change from 10 years ago in 2008 for just one single home on an acre, 1.6 acres that would include nearly an acre of Type 1 forest conservation. Our application was deferred in 2011 pending the completion of the Glen Hill study from the 2002 master plan. We were again deferred in 2016 pending completion of the 10-year comprehensive water and sewer plan. We were last tabled last year in July by the T&E committee pending further discussions on the 10-year water and sewer plan. And if I'm not mistaken, I think you guys approved that just recently. There's some attachments. I'm not going to get into all that I've included. You might want to just refresh your memory on some of the stuff. But with the executive and DEP's recommendation for approval, we now appreciate your unanimous support as well under the peripheral sewer policy. We look forward to obtaining Park and Planning's unanimous support next Thursday, and hope to hear good things from T&E, and I'll be back here for your unanimous support on the 30th. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smart. Is it Ms. Inani?
Siam Enani.
Siam Inani. Great. Please.
Actually, after hearing the first testimony, I wanted to leave because mine seems so trivial compared to what I heard. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my case to you. I am the owner of 12,000 Piney Meeting House Road, consisting of 8.6 acres, known as Lot 2. I also own Outlot A, immediately to the north of Lot 2. I come before you to request approval to transfer the right to the sewer connection to which Lot 2 is entitled to, Outlot A. I understand the objective of the county's water and sewer policy, but unfortunately the policy does not address the unique aspects of my particular situation. Critically, this request will not increase the number of connections. It is simply a transfer. Equally important, granting this request will not establish an unintended precedent, given the unique aspects of my case. We purchased Lot 2 and Outlot A last year. Lot 2 relies on septic, but is entitled to a sewer connection. The prior owner filed the sewer category request with the intention of developing up to 4 lots on Lot 2, utilizing septic and transferring the sewer connection to which Lot 2 is entitled to Outlot A. To this end, he was successful in getting Lot 2 to perk in several areas. In contrast, we have no interest in subdividing our property or selling it to a developer that would build several homes in lieu of the existing farm. We are horse people who want to preserve this beautiful land by creating a beautiful farm. Tellingly, we just applied for a farm tax category status. However, we would like to transfer the right to the sewer hookup to Outlot A for the following reasons. Outlot A is infested with termites, rats, raccoons, and many more rodents. There are large trees that have fallen over the years, which created a perfect habitat for these rodents. Huge rats, as big as cats, and I'm not kidding, are roaming freely on the property, and unfortunately, they found their way into our home on Lot 2 a long time ago. We found large holes underground in the foundation of the house, and the repairs cost us $9,000. But that still didn't take care of the problem. 2 of our neighbors who back up the outlots have already raised their concerns to me regarding the infestation because it's affecting them as well. We hired an extermination company, but they made it clear to us that the only way to eliminate the infestation and tackle this serious health problem at its source is to make a major investment to clean up the entire outlot. We bought Lot 2 and Outlot A year ago, but the rodent problem originating from Outlot A is so significant that we have not yet been able to live in the existing house on Lot 2. The prior owner requested transferring the sewer connection from Lot 2 to the outlot in order to develop as many homes as possible on the property. My request is for a completely different reason. The cost to clean up Outlot A is north of $20,000. transferring the connection with allow outlet A to ultimately be developed, which will allow the much-needed cleanup of the property to occur.
Thank you.
Again, this
Thank you.
request transfer will in
Thank
no...
you. We've got the, I'm sorry, it's 3 minutes is the limit. So have your written testimony, and we can refer to it for the rest of.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Clifford. Oh, you can remain there until, there may be a question for you, so you might like to remain there.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Thank
it's okay.
I'd like to hear more about those rats, but let me just do this first. I'm James Clifford of the law firm of Clifford Boynton. That was a lovely lady who was sitting in a seat a few minutes ago. I thought Mr. Katz might say something about our comparison in looks, but Debelius and
Let's wait
Hyatt.
for it.
This is a farm that my clients are the Triconians, and they have a dairy farm. They stopped dairying about 25 years ago. Most of the property, 116 acres or so, is in crops. It was split zoned in 1994 by the Clarksburg Master Plan using a creek bed as the dividing line between the two zones. Everything on the west side of this creek bed was RE1. It kind of goes along Route 27 and the main roads, which is also Kings Valley. It's very strange what happened to it because it kind of got squeezed off in the middle. So there's a piece up at the top of Kings Valley and there's a piece down at the bottom on 27. That became RE1, and the rest of the property on the other side of the creek bed was rural cluster. We got caught in a catch-22 because after that, in 2012, the state put it in Tier 1, which means that you can't have septic on the property. Well, RC also doesn't allow sewer. So the rural cluster property could not be used. It was in the wrong tier, in the wrong zone. So what we've come for is just to get a category change for the RE1, water and sewers adjacent to the property, abutting the property, and in some places on the property. So we'd like the RE1 property to be properly categorized as the county exec has recommended, which is W3S3. And then the only change we have from what the county exec had, and this was just because I don't think any of us thought it through too much, is that we probably ought to make it a W3 on the rural cluster. That would give us an opportunity when the tier is changed and we can actually use the rural cluster zoning, that we would condition a W3 on that property and conditioned on it being the cluster option being used. That way, public water's there, and it makes it far more efficient to develop a piece of property with public water and septic than it does with well and septic, because you can push things together a little bit closer and don't have those radiuses that you have to follow for wells. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Elrich. Is that from before? Yeah. Okay. Appreciate your testimony today. We look forward to taking up these requests in committee and at the full council. Now we have a public hearing on a supplemental appropriation to the county government's FY19 operating budget for the circuit court in the amount of $200,000 for the Maryland Electronic Courts data migration and testing. The Public Safety Committee work session is tentatively scheduled for October 4th. And persons wishing to submit additional material for the council's consideration should do so before the close of business today. There are no witnesses or speakers for that public hearing. And so we will move to the next item, and this one will be followed by action. This is a public hearing on expedited bill 2918, bond authorization. This bill would authorize the county to issue certain bonds, authorize these bonds and bonds previously authorized to be consolidated for sale and issued, sold, and delivered as a single issue. It will also deauthorize certain bonds previously authorized. Action is tentatively scheduled immediately following the hearing. There are no speakers for this hearing. And so now we will move to, and this is, I see a notation that we have the motion and a roll call under the public hearing. That doesn't quite.
We're going back into legislative session for this bill.
So are we on we're still on item 14 though?
Yes.
All right, got it. So this is expedited bill 2918, bond authorization.
So moved.
It's been moved by Mr. Rice, seconded by Council Vice President Navarro. This is a roll call. Ms. Paradise.
Mr. Elrich?
Yes.
Mr. Elrich votes yes. Mr. Hucker?
Yes.
Mr. Hucker votes yes. Mr. Rice?
Yes.
Mr. Rice votes yes. Mr. Leventhal?
Yes.
Mr. Leventhal votes yes. Ms. Florine?
Yes.
Ms. Florine votes yes. Mr. Katz?
Yes.
Mr. Katz votes yes. Ms. Navarro?
Yes.
Ms. Navarro votes yes. Mr. Reamer?
Yes, and that is unanimous among those present. And now we move on to item, do we move on to item 15? That's the same thing? I'm just not seeing anything on that in my, this is a legislative item.
It's in the same packet. Item 15 and 14 are on the same because they're companions.
All right, so this is a thank you. It's been moved by Mr. Rice, seconded by Ms. Navarro. Resolution to consolidate previously authorized notes for sale and issuance is a single issue. And this is a show of hands. All those in favor, please raise your hands. That is unanimous among those present. And now we will need a motion to go. Ms. Florine.
If I could beg the council's indulgence to be added in support, I'm assuming you voted in support of item number 9.
Sure we did.
We did.
The Goldsboro Road sidewalk. If I could be added in support, thank you.
Thank you. Noted for the record. Now, we will, we need a motion to go into a proposed closed session to consider matters that concern the proposal for 2 businesses or industrial organizations to locate, expand, or remain in the state pursuant to Maryland Code General Provisions, Article 3-305A4. Topic is retention and expansion of certain businesses in the county.
So moved.
Been moved by Mr. Katz, seconded by Ms. Navarro. And this is a show of hands in favor of the proposed closed session, and that is unanimous among those present. So we will now move to closed session. Thank you.